On an overgrown path, shrouded in the shade of century-old trees, father and son were returning home, passing a time-forgotten building with faded signs that read Cooking Club and Handicraft Club. They had long ago merged with the rhythm of this land where every day was filled with the work of hands and the silence of nature. Well, shall we begin? Words hovering in the air like an invitation to another but invariably valuable day of labor. The sun was already setting, and its last rays were shining through the foliage when my son, covering himself from the blinding light with his hand, mumbled apologetically, "Well, yes, I'm sorry." The father, whose face darkened with displeasure, only grimly threw back, "Chihiro, look, the sun is out." It was their routine, dialogues without embellishments, where every word was weighty and familiar like their daily journey home. Father, addressing invisible interlocutors, exclaimed with irony in his voice, "Do you want me to rest outside? Ah, heaven." The words were full of defiance and tired sarcasm, perhaps to the hardships of fate or to those who had once left their building in oblivion. He was shouting into the void, reflecting in his voice the echoes of days past and the inevitability of nights to come. Their lives were as simple as these moments of evening, repetitive, but each time leaving a unique imprint in the memory of the rural landscape. "Oh, wow," my father muttered faintly as if answering an unspoken question. His voice was not so much angry as tired with the unshared understanding of his labor. In the workshop, soaked with the smell of wood and the warmth of coals, time passed. My father, armed with long experience and an unchanging bandana, watched the fire carefully as it turned the raw wood into embers. "Why does he resent it?" thought the son, watching his father from the corner of the room. His gaze was full of incomprehension, and his hands were automatically doing their usual work. The son, concentrating on cleaning a wooden plank, was busy with his part of their family business. His silent diligence contradicted the inner restlessness caused by his father's sighs. In every movement of his knife was the desire for perfection taught by his father. In every fold of his clothing was the desire to earn approval. Their silent symphony of work, echoing with the crackling of the embers and the whisper of the flames, told the story not only of today, but of all those days that had faded into oblivion, leaving behind only the ashes of past successes and the relentless pursuit of tomorrow's mastery. In the workshop, where every stroke of the hammer and stroke of the steel wing told stories of the past and dreams of the future, lived a master craftsman. Rokuhiro Kunishiga's name was known far beyond their small village, and he was spoken of as the most famous blacksmith in the land. The fire that licked the new steel with flame was his companion in the creation of exceptional swords, the uniqueness of which lay in the special forging technique passed down through the generations. His father's hammer descended confidently on the anvil. Knock, knock, knock. It sounded like the music of ancient legends where each sword had its own soul, and each spark was like a living note in the symphony of life and death. The son watched and learned, absorbing every sound and every movement, knowing that one day he would continue this great art. His son, a young man with a determined gaze and unwavering ambition, spent his days learning from his father. "I learn under my father day in and day out," he shared, looking at the master whose movements were precise and sure, as if each sword already knew its destiny before the fire shaped it. The moment of truth for every blacksmith is when steel meets fire. It is a test of material and craftsmanship, a play of elements where a sword is born from the flames. Rokuhiro, the master whose name resounds among blacksmiths as a hymn to craftsmanship, in this second embodies the ancient ritual of transformation. His hands, strong and precise, hold the sword over the coals, allowing the heat to penetrate the steel, preparing it for future battles and feats. In the forge, where the echo of the hammer echoed in the silence, tension hung in the air. The son, raising the hammer above his head, froze, waiting for the command. "Strike!" Rokuhiro's loud order cut through the air. The hammer struck the red-hot metal, sparks flying in all directions like stars in the night sky. The blacksmith's face reflected the seriousness of the moment, his gaze focused and determined. "Now," was the only word needed to synchronize their actions. His eyes read the unwavering skill passed from father to son through fire, steel, and sweat. Away from the blazing forge, life went on as usual. In the aquarium, filled with calm water and the quiet rustling of fins, the fish continued their usual circles. Their peaceful, uh-huh. In contrast to the thunder of the forge reminded them that even in the most stressful moments of life, there is always a corner of calm somewhere. In the midday silence of the house, where the morning light streamed in through the windows, a man sat at the table, deep in thought. "Father," his son started to say, but his words faltered as his gaze fell on the aquarium, and he thought about something of his own. Rokuhiro, busy with his morning chores, suddenly heard his son's address. "That's how it is." His son's monologue was interrupted without really beginning, as if his thoughts were still with the fish in the aquarium. 15. The boy entered the room and broke the silence. "Breakfast is ready." His voice was subdued, but there was a familiar determination in it. The son nodded gratefully, his face lighting up with a smile. His father's concerns always brought him comfort. "Do you often have conversations with them, the fish?" he asked his father, watching as his son once again became distracted, staring at the fish swimming in the aquarium. "Ah, it is." The son smiled as he answered his father, acknowledging his little escapes from reality to the simplicity of the aquarium world. These moments were a respite for him from the rigorous rhythm of their work together, allowing him to forget for a moment the heaviness of the blacksmith's hammer and the fire of the forge. In the cozy setting of a small kitchen where everything is in its place, Rokuhiro, a manly blacksmith with broad shoulders, sits in front of a hot bowl of ramen. He is frozen like a statue, and confusion is written all over his face. His voice is full of regret and slight irony. He admits his mistake and wishes him a pleasant appetite, but there is a sense in his voice that the meal no longer seems so appealing. The boy looks at his father with genuine surprise. His eyes are a mixture of concern and embarrassment. He cannot understand how his father, so skillful with iron and fire, can be so clumsy with a spoon and chopsticks. The boy interjects, puzzled, as if trying to solve a riddle as to whether the goldfish could have said something so unusual that it led to this outcome. Now they are both at the table, where the mood seems lighter and more conversational. The son looks away, his eyes full of thoughtfulness, and we can only guess at the depth of his thoughts. Rokuhiro continues to eat, but his attention is now focused on his son. The words he speaks reflect a father's pride and hope. His boy wants to study seriously. The weight and importance of the future challenges that lie ahead for the young mind can be felt in this statement. Rokuhiro's son, a boy with serious and grown-up eyes, looked at his father with mild bewilderment. He stood on the doorstep, leaning against the door jamb, his gaze full of quiet thoughtfulness. The atmosphere around them was imbued with the spirit of everyday life and simple pleasures, and the dialogue between father and son flowed softly and naturally, intertwined with the sounds of everyday life. Rokuhiro kept the conversation light, but there was more to his voice than just words. He was determined to support his son's dreams no matter how they sounded in the humming silence of the kitchen. In the forge, the place where fire and metal intertwine in a dance of creation, there was the sharp sound of a hammer hitting an anvil. Sparks spattered around, illuminating the blacksmith's tired but determined face. "Bam!" echoed through the room, emphasizing the weight and precision of each blow. The blacksmith looked at the result of his work with strain in his eyes. Straight, the single word he uttered carried the weight of years of skill and endless striving for perfection. His gaze reflected not only concentration, but endless self-discipline passed down from generation to generation. As the hammer in his hands rose again, preparing for the next blow, his determined sigh rippled through the air. The short sound that accompanied each movement was like a mantra, sustaining his strength and concentration in this ritual of creation. In his every movement, he could feel the steadfastness of the mountain ranges from which the metal for his work had been mined. There was silence in the house, broken only by the light splashing of the water in the aquarium. These babies were brought home by their father, the son thought, his gaze lingering on the smooth movements of the fish, which made him forget the hustle and bustle of the day. They seemed like little magicians able to clear the air of tension. The musings were interrupted by my father entering the room with an energy and enthusiasm that could have lit a star. You're about to get excited. Go see what I bought." You could sense the pleasant anticipation in his voice of the surprise he was about to share. The son, at first surprised at his father's unexpected energy, bent his head over the book, but interest immediately awakened in his heart. "What?" His gaze met his father's, and curiosity kindled in him. "I went into the store on my way back from the grinder," the man went on, and in his hands glittered a find worthy of the story he was ready to unfold to his son. The glow of Rokuhiro's eyes lit up the room as he opened a small bag with 2 goldfish swimming in it. "Fresh goldfish?" he exclaimed, like a little boy who had just found a treasure. It was more than just the new inhabitants of the aquarium. It was a symbol of wonder and magic that he wanted to share with his son. But the boy's reaction was restrained. His expression remained unperturbed. "What? And where is your joy?" The father was perplexed as he observed his son's calmness. Rokuhiro's joy was palpable, but it did not resonate in the boy's heart. The son looked at his father with a slight smile, but there was a look of concern in his eyes. "Who do you think is going to take care of them?" His question was full of the realization that a new responsibility now rested on their shoulders. "Certainly not you, father," he thought, knowing the passion and forgetfulness of his father, who so often needed a boost for daily chores, not to mention caring for the new members of the family. In the light of the setting sun streaming through the window, Rokuhiro stood at the table with a winning smile. "The vendor told me that goldfish are good luck." His voice sounded cheerful, as if he had shared the secret of the greatest wisdom with his son. The son, with his back to his father, immersed in his own thoughts, listened to his words. The boy's attention was drawn to the unknown depths of his own imagination, where his own plots and experiences were spinning. His father, for his part, had no doubts about the power of ancient beliefs, and his enthusiasm enveloped the room like a warm blanket. A man was showing his new pet, expressing his thoughts on the symbolism of their coloring. "Red brings good luck, black drives away trouble," he reasoned, and his gaze was full of confidence that each fish carried a special meaning. "And this 3-colored one?" he asked, hinting that each color was capable of influencing their lives, bringing it special shades of happiness. The son, mildly amused by these folk notions, replied to him with a touch of sarcasm. "Does some cool stuff too?" His words came out with ease, and there was a sense of love for his father in them despite the ironic overtones. Then my father, entering the room with a bag in his hands, cheerfully declared, "If there are fresh goldfish in the house, they are lucky." His voice filled the space with optimism. "Why don't you stop saying fresh every time?" The boy no longer hid a smile, for his father's words were full of good humor and warmth. "Anyway, they're all good luck, that's why I took them," Rokuhiro concluded, and his steps were light as if he had just found the key to an inexhaustible source of joy. The boy looked at his father in disbelief and said that a fish is called fresh when it is about to be eaten. When his father thought about it, as if he could really do that, he decided that he would take care of the fish. The man's face was full of thoughtfulness and incomprehension. It was as if he were trying to find answers to the questions that had always plagued him. The boy thought that with a father like him it would be a hassle. In the end, after buying this pet, he had even more worries. The next day, they continued their hard work in the forge. The hammer pounded like a drum, beating out the rhythm of the work. Sparks flew in all directions. The blacksmith's face was focused on his work. He had to make another masterpiece of blacksmithing. Every day coming to his forge, he took up his hard work, his son bandana tied over his head to protect his hair. He watched his father expertly forge another masterpiece of blacksmithing from softened metal. Once again, the hammer came down on the anvil with a loud sound, spraying sparks of light in different directions. Soon, this lifeless piece of metal would yield another beautiful sword that would serve its owner in battle. The forge was filling with bright light with every second. The work was boiling. Sparks of fire were flying in different directions, and the young man was descending on the heated piece of metal with a new force. The heated piece of metal lay between the hammer and anvil, preparing to take the next hardest blow, and would soon turn into a sharp sword blade. At this time, another stranger was approaching Rokuhiro's house. The man draped his jacket over his shoulders, and with a casual stride approached closer and closer. Finally, he came to his destination. The father, heated by the fervor of the work, turned to his son and said in a heavy voice that it was time for them to start dinner. In this hard work, it was necessary to take at least some breaks to avoid fainting. The man looked at his son with an appraising gaze and said with satisfaction that the boy's arms were getting stronger. Chihiro looked at his body in surprise. He couldn't believe that he was getting stronger and stronger every day. But then suddenly the father laughed and said that the boy was a long way from him. The man rolled up his sleeve and showed his huge muscles. The man had gotten incredibly fit over the years working in the forge. Suddenly the boy turned around and looked at the entrance to the forge, as if he saw something strange there. Another man stood in the doorway, holding a bag of groceries in his hands. When the blacksmith heard this, he thanked him joyfully, and a radiant smile spread across his face. The man handed the bag of groceries into the hands of the boy and asked how he was doing. Leaving the smithy, in a disgruntled tone, the blacksmith said that the man would have warned him that he was coming. A friendly dialogue ensued between them. Rokuhiro asked the newcomer how things were going in the city, and he replied with a low expression that it was not peaceful. Rokuhiro nodded understandingly and lowered his gaze. The man's name was Shiba-san. He was an old friend of my father's, and he often came to visit them, bringing food or just checking up on them. The fish in the tank were swimming in different directions, waiting for a treat. One of them swam closer to the water's edge to catch the food that someone's caring hand had started pouring into the tank. Shiba-san looked at the boy and said in a cheerful voice that he had grown a lot. The boy did not believe these words and asked the man if he was sure. Shiba, in a loud voice, said that the kid didn't get bigger than him after all. Let him apologize. Chihiro looked at him with a calm gaze. Soon they sat down at the table and prepared to eat. The father of the main character was already in the kitchen. Sitting at the table, Shiba asked the boy how his training quokka. After some thought, the boy replied that he was doing well. He was getting the hang of it. After thinking for a bit, the man sarcastically said that he thought the protagonist's father was the most suitable representative. Hearing this, the blacksmith grudgingly asked him to stop. Shiba smiled and told him not to be modest. The man's gaze grew serious as he began his story. Shiba said that Chihiro's father, 16 years ago during the war, was more famous than they, the ones who actually fought. He grinned and said that it would not be an exaggeration to say that the famous blades he had created had ended that long, bloody war. Throughout the story, the man squinted at the blacksmith and smiled good-naturedly. Suddenly, the man's voice became serious, and he told the boy to remember that his father had saved many people. He was a hero. Chihiro sat quietly across from him with his arms folded and listened to every word. He was well aware of his father's accomplishments. The boy lowered his gaze and said in a sad voice that he had heard that the number of those people was over 100. In the boy's voice, he could hear regret and even envy at his father's exploits. Smiling, Shiba said that he listened to these grateful speeches with joy in his heart every time. People say such things very often. Everyone remembers Rokuhiro's exploits very well. The man pointed his finger at the boy and squinted at him and asked, "Does he work hard every day, just like his father?" There was no reproach in the man's voice, only a friendly sneer. All this time, the boy just sat there looking at the man with a calm, serious gaze. Chihiro smiled and said that he had heard that too over 100 times. It was obvious that the guy was sick of hearing all this. At this time, my father was in the kitchen, and I could only hear their conversation in half an ear. The room was idyllic and the family cozy. The man wanted to say something else, but he suddenly stopped short. The boy looked questioningly at his father, who paid no attention to them, but was busy with his own work. Shiba suddenly seemed to pull himself together and said in a loud voice that he was talking too much. It was time to finish. The man rose and with a quick step walked out of the house. At parting, he turned around and gave them a friendly wave. The father and his son stood in the doorway, watching him with serious eyes. From a distance, it was hard to tell them apart, except that the father was much larger than his son. Rokuhiro made a disgruntled face and crunched his neck. The son looked at his father and asked, "What's the matter?" The father continued to crunch his neck as if he didn't notice the question. After finishing his procedures, the man said that the boy would soon turn. If he wants to become a real master of forging swords, he should know not only about the positive sides of this business. Still tilting his head to the side, the man thought. He searched for the words to properly begin the difficult conversation with his son. There was thoughtfulness in the man's eyes. Chihiro looked at his father with his usual gaze. Although he didn't look interested on the outside, inside he was eager to know what lay ahead. After a moment's silence, the son said the man can tell him. But it's not that he thought much about these negative aspects. The boy's voice became more confident, but seriously. He wanted to become a master like his father. All this time, the blacksmith was like a living embodiment of the ideal for him. They went into the house. My father was huge, so he ducked down to avoid hitting his head on the door jamb. After thinking for a while, he said he understood. The room was quite spacious. A little in the distance lay a sword hidden in its scabbard. The man approached the stand and said in a serious voice that there were several more balls stored in the basement, most of them created before the protagonist was born. He was in awe of his weapons, as he understood the labor involved in making them. The boy came closer to his father and bowed his head with interest and asked, "Were they all used in the war?" His father nodded his head, carefully taking the weapon. He lovingly said that blades always save people and give the beginning of a new era. It was evident how much the man treasured these things. Slightly sliding the sword out of its sheath, the blacksmith looked at its shining blade, which seemed to reflect the warrior's entire resolve. Then the man became serious, he said. "For all that, a sword is a tool for killing people." The boy continued to watch his father's actions. Although his gaze was emotionless, it was just a mask. The man suddenly swung his sword, preparing to strike. The blade, with great speed, cutting through the air with a whistling sound, began to approach the bamboo stick, and soon, in one motion, sliced it in half. Not my question hung in the air. Could they be indifferent to the death for which the sword was created? It was a rhetorical question, of course. Taking people's lives is bad, but war is war. The blacksmith's voice sounded as serious as possible. In the wrong hands, swords can take the lives of decent people. Realizing this, it is necessary to challenge the creation of blades. In a calm but serious tone, Father said that the one who should wield the sword is the one who has faith, the one who will destroy the bad and save the weak. They are such. This man had a great responsibility, for he was creating a murder weapon, carefully hiding the sword in its scabbard. He said that responsibility and faith are necessary qualities for one who wields such a deadly weapon. He turned to his son and told him that next time, he would first sell the actual made katana. Every such time he entrusted the sword into the hands of a man, these two qualities would be pressed upon him. The son listened attentively to his father's instruction, absorbing every word. With a serious look at his child, the man asked him if the boy could cope with such a burden of responsibility. The boy thought about it. It was difficult for him to answer this question unequivocally. To make a sword is certainly difficult, but to take responsibility for killing people is even more difficult. His eyes drooped. The boy's gaze became serious, and in a firm voice he said that despite everything, he was ready to take on such responsibility. The man looked at his son silently. He was very proud that he had raised such a man. But that was not all. The boy had much more to learn and realize before he could become a real master. After a little silence, the blacksmith turned around, and with a quick, firm step went to the exit of the room, throwing over his shoulder to his son that it was time to go back to work. The boy looked at him in surprise and asked, "Is it right now?" Turning around for a second, the man said that after saying that, he would expect great success from his son. The gaze was firm and clear. Chihiro looked at his father without taking his eyes off of him. That's right. Now he had to become a real man and learn to take responsibility for his actions. He was alone in the empty room, thinking about everything that had been said. He looked at his father's broad back as he slowly drifted off into the distance. Chihiro was a little afraid of what lay ahead, but his father was always ready to support him. After waiting a little while, the boy told his father to clean up the pieces of bamboo he had scattered during his performance. As if yanked back, the father turned around and said he would do it now. The tall castle rushed upwards towards the clouds themselves. It was a monstrous monolithic building that inspired fear and awe. There were many people gathered near the entrance. Life was going on as usual. Someone sat at a table and drank tea. Someone hurried on his business. The man with the bushy mustache slanted his contemptuous gaze to the side and ordered someone to be wasted. It was obvious from his face that it was not the first time he had to dispose of human lives, 38 months later. A man dressed in a ceremonial-colored shirt swung his katana, and in one fell swoop chopped up the poor man kneeling in front of him, his hands tied in a tight knot and hidden behind his back. It looked like an act of public execution. The last one left, the executioner did not even remove a drop of blood from his sword and said contemptuously that he would give him an easy death. The last survivor bowed his head and humbly awaited his fate. The man clutched the piece of paper with his huge hand. In a loud voice, he said that they were bullying them. He gets angry every time he sees them. His eyes were full of anger. In front of him stood a blood-stained boy. Tears were pouring from his eyes. His face was full of despair. He had already resigned himself to his fate. The man threw the pieces of paper on the floor. They looked like some kind of propaganda leaflets. With obvious anger in his voice, the man turned to the kid and told him to just give the names of the members of this movement. The flyers said for everyone to go after the Dragon Awakening faction. Another man holding a bloody katana said with a sneer that he was shaking so pathetically. Let him say something. After being silent for a while, the captive began to stammer his words. The bearded man looked at him with interest, waiting for him to say something. His eyes were burning with rage and he seemed about to breathe fire. The boy got his thoughts together and almost cried, saying that until this group came to town there was peace and quiet. But now they rule everything by brute force. Next to him lay the bloody corpse of another poor man. They steal money, land as they please. It's an outrage. The guy screamed with impotent anger. His eyes were burning with rage. There were drops of blood on his face, but he still didn't give up. It looked like he was part of some kind of resistance. The man got angry at such words and in a rage hit the guy in the face with his fist, blood splattered. After wiping his fist from the blood, the man calmed down a bit. In a calm voice, he said that it was very brave of him. But this guy's nothing but a lowlife. The poor guy was lying on the ground trying to recover from such a blow. The ringleader looked down at him and asked the guy in a dismissive tone, "Does he even know who's covering for him?" Spitting Alice spit a clot of blood on the ground. The guy looked at him with eyes full of anger. He replied that it was a black mage, so it didn't matter if the adults were shaking in fear. He should shut up and obey. The boy's words echoed through the vast building. On the balcony, a man dressed in a neat tuxedo stood, a wry smile on his face. He said quietly that he was interested in this guy. Suddenly, near the boy's face, some strange black shoots sprouted from the ground, looking like tree roots. The poor man's eyes widened with fear. He had already resigned himself to the fact that he was going to die. A man in a hat bent over as if trying to see something on the floor. Next to him stood other uniformed men who looked like members of the group. He was coming down the stairs, holding some sort of bundle in his hand. He turned to the head, saying that he had received payment just now. A smile gleamed on his face. Tension hung in the air. The man came a little closer and asked the people present if they had ever seen magic. He thought that bravery came from ignorance. At that time, the powerful roots of the tree had already completely encircled the boy's neck and were squeezing it tighter and tighter with each passing second. The poor man could already feel the air ceasing to flow into his lungs, and life was about to leave him. But he did not stop struggling. The man looked down at his victim and calmly asked, "Is this the first time?" I could see in his eyes that he could take a human life without blinking an eye. The boy could hardly breathe anymore. His eyes blurred, his awareness began to sink into a viscous abyss. A few more seconds and his life would be ruptured forever. Suddenly the man seemed to remember something and he smiled broadly again. He looked like an executioner taking the lives of his victims left and right. His lips moved and he quietly began to speak. As long as the head pays them to do so, they will not interfere with other people's work. The man with the beard said worriedly that he couldn't help but feel uneasy about their system. But when it comes to people who are so naive, he didn't get a chance to finish, because the man in the hat interrupted him. Folding two fingers, he said he thought he needed to explain even more politely. He had a strange tattoo on his arm. The man's gaze was cold and full of ruthless malice. A fire aura began to form around him. Behind him stood the boy, who was watching with eyes full of horror, the wooden trunk already completely wrapped around his neck, leaving only a small possibility of breathing to keep from losing consciousness. In the same calm, soulless voice, the man said that wood decomposes with time. A fire began to blaze in the middle of the room, inexplicably kept in the air. All the people watched this spectacle with horror. Corpses were lying everywhere. There was a distinct iron odor of blood in the air. The train's wheels cut the silence of the day. It was rushing forward, cutting through space like an arrow. Chihiro had already grown a lot and had matured a lot. His face had sharp features, but his gaze remained the same. A familiar voice called out to him, and he turned around. Shiba-san, a friend of his father's, came into the compartment. He wished the boy a good morning, and he had the same good-natured smile on his face. It turned out that it was impossible to upset this man with anything at all. The man came even closer to him and asked if he could sit next to him. He was holding a dried fish in his hand, the smell of which immediately filled the entire carriage. The boy looked at the man with surprise. Apparently, he didn't expect to see him here. "Does he eat capelin?" They agreed to meet at the station. "What's he doing here?" Shiba Slovno paid no attention to his bewilderment and said in a cheerful voice that it was beautiful weather. The kid continued to watch intently with his old acquaintance. It was the first time he had ever seen anyone eating dried fish on the go. The man nonchalantly plopped down on the seat across from the guy. He was in high spirits and asked with a sneer, what was the guy's harsh look? He offered Chihiro a fish, but he declined. Shiba sunk his teeth into the food like it was the last bite of his life and began to chew fiercely. The train was moving at a moderate speed, slowly rocking its passengers. White, fluffy clouds stretched across the sky, like ships sailing across the sky. A man asked the boy with interest if he could ask him a question. The boy reluctantly nodded his head. Shiba looked at the scar on the boy's face with interest. He was choosing words to tell him this in a softer way. His gaze was still cold and calculating. The man said that if the guy didn't want to, it was possible to heal that scar more beautifully. Hearing these words, the boy was embarrassed. He knew it himself, but he didn't care. While continuing to eat the fish, the man said, "That scar is right in the eye. Or will the guy leave it like that?" It's unclear why this man suddenly cared so much about what's on Chihiro's face. There was an awkward pause in the room. After a little silence, the boy began to speak. The noise of the train sounded measuredly, as if lulling its passengers to sleep. The guy seemed to have a hard time talking about it, but he overpowered himself and started talking. When he washed his face in the morning and looked in the mirror, he always saw that scar. Every word seemed to be difficult for him to say, despite his seemingly serious appearance. He immediately recalls that day every time he sees himself in the mirror. Shiba looked at him with an attentive gaze and listened. The boy continued to speak calmly. Thanks to him, he starts his day with a new dose of hatred. His voice sounded calm, but it was obvious that he was trying to hold back the anger that was gripping him. The man looked at him carefully, and as if in a cautionary tone said that if he continued to do so, he would surely break down. Lowering his eyes, the boy asked in an indifferent tone, should he stop doing that? He didn't seem to know what he wanted out of his life. So emotionless and cold was his voice. The man sighed heavily and took another bite from his fried fish. Outside the window, the cityscapes were passing by, blurring and turning into one continuous line. Soon the train arrived at its destination. Its wheels creaked and it stopped at another station. People began to come out of it in droves, and anxious, happy, and sad voices began to spread throughout the station. The huge locomotive emitted a blue vapor that filled almost the entire space of the station. There were a lot of people going about their business, and they didn't even seem to be paying attention to each other. The city lived its own life. Loud voices, the hum of cars, and birdsong blended into a cacophony. After a little thought, the man said that this city was run by the Dragon Awakening faction. Looking at him with a look of incomprehension, the boy asked, "Are these bandits somehow connected to them? Is he sure?" The man replied firmly that yes, he was sure. After a little thought, he said that he hadn't personally checked, but that was the only lead he'd managed to get. In a sad voice, the boy replied that he understood. Well, they had to move on. Chihiro said in a serious tone that they needed to assess the situation. If they would make contact, they could offer them a deal. The boys walked into the crowd of people and were immediately immersed in a multitude of voices. Shiba said it wouldn't work. Soon they came to a square where something terrible was happening. There were 4 hangmen hanging there. The one who had done it must have no principles in life. A few people were protesting, pointing their fingers at the scene of the horrible massacre. It was to be expected. The four poor men hanging on the ropes were members of the Purification faction. The man looked at them with a serious look. The Purification movement became a warning to others. Those who rule this city will not let anyone get in their way. Chihiro looked at this horrible sight with a blank stare, and seemed to not even pay attention to the fact that the man was addressing him. There was nothing but emptiness and hatred in his eyes. He was burning with the desire to take revenge on those freaks who allow themselves such inhumane acts. They're a group of real scum who'd sell their own mother. The kid gripped his katana tighter, clutching its hilt hard with his hand. He barely digested the urge right now to rush in and cut down these scum of society so they wouldn't poison the lives of other ordinary citizens. There were already a lot of people around. Some were angry. Some women were crying bitter tears as they watched this horrifying sight. The boy said with certainty that they would take over the apartment of this group, if only the man would lead him to the right place. Near a large building, several men in dress uniforms were sitting at a table. They were talking amongst themselves and joking around. Their lightheartedness was very infectious. A few people were sitting at a table and jokingly talking among themselves. They were saying that they were the busiest people in town. Another kid with white hair came up to them and said reproachfully that they were just sitting on their asses, that things would be easier if the swordsman helped them. One of the men sitting at the table smiled broadly and said that if some idiot who forgot where he belonged came in here, he'd slaughter him right away. The guy with white hair sighed and said that all the people sit peacefully and let themselves be ruled like cattle. Will the danger actually appear? He didn't have time to say anything, as a knife swept past him with great speed, slicing through his carotid artery, splattering everyone around him with blood. After that, it stabbed against the wall, not far from his companion's face. They didn't even have time to react. For a few seconds, they still didn't understand what had happened, but blood was already gushing from the poor man's neck. Several people turned to the direction where the knife had come from. If they didn't understand the situation, they looked that way. The boy who had been the victim tilted his head to the side, blood gushing out of his neck in quick spurts, and dripping onto the snow-white tablecloth and his dress shirt. He didn't even realize who had killed him, but his fate was already sealed. Shiba-san stood a little in the distance and said with an ironic smile that he was very embarrassed. His hand had just slipped. The poor guy he had just stabbed with one blow was already sprawled on the table, bleeding. The people sitting at the table didn't even realize the horror of what was happening, as Chihiro jumped onto the table and grabbed the head of one of the people present with his hand. One of the men sat in a stupor, unable to do anything. He was trying to understand who had dared to attack them so brazenly in broad daylight. Fear glittered in his eyes. Chihiro slipped his katana to the neck of one of the men, ironically apologizing for interrupting their conversation so unceremoniously. The man gritted his teeth, still trying to figure out who it was. The men realized that they had been so boldly attacked only when the body of the first murdered man fell with a clatter onto the table, splattering the others with his blood. The kid turned around in one swift movement, standing on the table, and in one fell swoop slashed the necks of 3 other people. Blood started pouring out. They didn't even realize it. The bearded man squinted and said he understood and thanked the executioner for his work. Talking to this man made him uncomfortable, but there was no way out. Turning to his victim, the man said his silence would lead to nothing good, so he was dragging his family into it. The poor man gritted his teeth, blood streaming down his face, but he couldn't wipe it off because his hands were tied. Through gritted teeth, the kid muttered that he had no family. The man leaned in and said he was sorry, but the information had just come in. He fell silent for a rhetorical pause. Just got a tip about the kid's little sister. The man moved even closer to the poor man's face, so close that he could already hear his stinking breath. He handed the leaf to his subordinate, and in an orderly tone told him to go to the address written here. Hearing this, the poor man lost the power of speech, and his breath came in spurts, and his eyes widened to the utmost. The subordinates gathered and began to leave the room with a quick step. The man turned to his victim and said in a snide tone that he must hate himself for not being able to hide it. The poor guy didn't listen to him. A deafening scream came out of his mouth as he tried his best to stop these people. The bleeding guy shouted that he understood everything. He would tell everything he knew. One of the subordinates opened the door wide, ready to go out and execute the deadly order, but suddenly something changed. Something happened that none of them expected. One of the bastard's bodies was immediately cut open by the katana. blood gushing out of the wide wound before they could even realize it, as one of them fell to the ground, saying goodbye to his life. In front of them stood a guy in a black jacket. All present immediately grabbed their katanas. His movements were as fast and precise as lightning, and no one could have predicted them. Blood was pouring out in rivers, and screams were heard everywhere, turning into a gurgling sound. The poor lad, who had just been tortured to death, looked with horror at his mysterious savior, who now caused him even greater terror. The figure of the protagonist from this angle looked simply horrifying. His look was all but lifeless. He stood covered in drops of blood and severed limbs. Now, he looked like some kind of ghost that had appeared to carry out a bloody revenge. The man with the beard turned around. His eyes became frightened. He shouted, "Who are they? What are they doing here?" A fleeting hope flashed across the boy's face. Is he going to be rescued now? Chihiro stood in the doorway and looked into the back of the building. Shiba-san was sitting on the corpses of dead people behind him. There was blood everywhere, and the bodies of the guards who were supposed to protect this place. But they lacked professionalism. Upon hearing the man's question about what the guards do, Shiba, parodying the voice of one of the guards, said that they shirked their duties. Sitting on the half-dead body of one of the guards, the man said that he was the father of the boy who was only Rokuhira Kunishiga. Then he asked if he had heard of him. The man couldn't say anything but clenched his teeth and looked up. Shiba continued his story. He said that this man, and only he, possessed special processing techniques. It was a master loner. Behind the back of their leader, more assassins had already appeared, like chain dogs ready to fulfill any order. The man asked in a stern voice what they wanted. The protagonists were now outnumbered, but it turned out they didn't care at all. Standing in the doorway, the kid looked like a real butcher from bloody urban legends. In a quiet voice, he said that all he wanted to do was ask something, and he also had something to tell them. His face was transformed and contorted with rage. He was almost all stained with the blood of his enemies. The boy's voice became fierce, almost shouting. He said that such scoundrels as these had no right to hold a sword. At such words, the bearded man became furious. He ordered his servants to immediately deal with these scoundrels who dared to invade their domain. He ordered them to finish off the intruders immediately. The men rushed towards the guy with their katanas out, preparing to chop him at the same moment. Their leader ordered them to be killed on the spot and then hanged. But these words had no effect on the boy, and he only gripped the hilt of his katana tighter. His face was calm and centered. He wasn't afraid of such petty criminals as these people were. His goal was much higher. Rokuhira Kunishiga etched black magic into the blade. Shiba silently watched from the sidelines. The protagonist's father created a magic sword with special powers. Chihiro stood in the doorway, ready to finish off those bastards here and now. A short sigh escaped from the guy's mouth. He gathered all the energy in his body and channeled it into the sword. At the same time, his weapon became a part of his hand. With a metallic sound, the sword began to emerge from its sheath. It was covered in some strange energy that inspired fear and terror. It was the heaven of the abyss. The guy stood in the doorway as if he were some ancient swordsman preparing to slay a monster. It was partly so. He swung his sword and magical carps appeared from nowhere. The sword began to glow with magical energy. Those present didn't understand. What the hell was this? Who the hell is this guy? They stopped and watched in horror. Shiba-san watched from the sidelines and thought, this kid has a blade that his father made last. He put his whole life into it. Chihiro looked at his victims like a hunter who had found his long-awaited prey. A vortex of magical energy began to swirl around him, infusing the sword with each passing second. His opponents were already running at him with all their legs, swinging their katanas. They didn't realize yet what kind of power they would have to face. The air was filled not only with sparks from the clash of swords, but also with the heavy weight of unspoken words lurking in the depths of their gazes. It was a battle not for life, but for honor, in which every blow echoed through the ruined walls. My heart beats in time with the echo of footsteps and the clash of swords. The invisible storm gathers its forces, overwhelmed and tense. In every look, one can read the foreboding of impending chaos. Suddenly, there are shouts and a whirlwind of black cloaks bursts into the crowd, bringing destruction. Swords plow through the air, shimmering in the light of the setting sun. Chihiro, standing out among the others, stares piercingly at his opponent, ready for a decisive attack. With every movement he makes, anxious sparks of anticipation fly. The crowd retreats, leaving room for a duel. Fates intertwine in a dance of edge and force, where every sword stroke is filled with determination, and every slope is a whisper of death. Hearts freeze in anticipation of the outcome, knowing only the shadows that dance on the walls in the crooked mirror of this war. As the shadows grow longer and faces fill with gloom, the pulse quickens. Anticipation hangs in the air, and a spark flares in this tension. Resistance is born where there seems to be no hope. Faces are frozen in a mask of horror as a hero emerges from the darkness, ready to defy fate. His hand grips the hilt of his sword, his eyes sparkle with fearlessness. Niskiki. His cry cuts through the air, the echo of his will spreading faster than the wind that drives the clouds. And while the storm rages on earth, life goes on unperturbed elsewhere. Birds perched on wires become mute witnesses to human passions, unaware of the battles raging beneath them. They lead their melodies, ignoring the noise of swords and shouts, reminding us that even in chaos there is room for calm. In a world where every day is a struggle, moments of respite are worth their weight in gold. Siba-san throws his head back as he swallows a bite of fried fish, a small victory over fatigue, over pain. He closes his eyes for a split second, and in that silence inside he finds a tiny island of peace. But his tranquility is deceptive. Opening his eyelids, he sees only destruction before him. The glazed eyes of war victims stare at him, waiting for answers. He steps through the silence, through the door that separates him from what is left behind. "Tell me everything you know about Hisyaku." The words, born of despair and hope, echoed off the ruins. Hisyaku? What do you mean? The words spill out through the tension, his gaze sliding over faces, searching for the answer he already knows but can't accept. Secrets lurk in every shadow, and every whisper could be a thunderclap that brings everything around him down. The figure of Chihiro appears before him, clad in a dark cloak, reflecting the essence of what the world calls the Black Magicians Organization. They are a web enveloping the city, invisible and pervasive. "Those behind you," he says as if it were a simple statement, but each word weighs like a sentence. And here he is, standing before his judge in the person of the one who accuses him, who passes judgment. You pretend you had nothing to do with it, but it doesn't matter. Your subordinates have already thrown you in hell. Fate has already decided their share, and it is inexorable. In this game, every move can be the last, and every word can be the beginning of the end. After facing the inevitable, the hallway is silent, broken only by heavy footsteps. The smell of pain lingers in the air. "Are you okay?" A calm voice cuts through the silence, addressed to a wounded comrade sitting on the floor, tired from the struggle. There was no response, only a groan of stubbornness and rejection of reality from someone struggling to keep himself on his feet. "Monsters. Hisyaku. Those people." His words intertwined with fear and the realization that they were facing something unimaginable. "If you are plotting to go against them, you are out of your mind." The exclamation is more than a warning. It is a plea to stay out of the coming storm. But the eyes of the one who stands before him tell a different story. They are determined to face that storm head-on, even if it takes his last breath. Do I look like a sane person? I don't care what kind of monsters they are. Chihiro's words pierce the air with as much determination as his gaze. He's not looking for approval. He's not waiting for understanding. His soul has already chosen a path, and now there is no room for doubt. "Kill them all. I must." These words are not a request, not a question. They are a statement of a mission he intends to accomplish no matter what. He knows that every step forward could be his last, but he will not stop. "It's all untied," Siba said quietly, trying to untie the ropes on the poor man's arms. "You've had a hard time," said Shiba as he helped Pan up. "Thank you very much." The words of gratitude burst out through the pain and fatigue to the stranger who had become an unexpected ally in the storm of events. And you, actually." He tries to find the words to ask about the stranger whose appearance is shrouded in mystery. His gaze is full of questions, and each one seems vital. "I am Siba," a short answer said with the same confidence as his actions. a name that becomes another mystery in this story, where each character harbors a deep layer of meanings and motivations. The world around them seemed to freeze. I don't care what kind of monsters they are. I must. The words are lost in the ruins of the destroyed room. He realizes that his task is far from over, and he faces a choice that will determine not only his fate, but the fate of many. Kill them all, he says, and there is determination in his eyes, the same determination that leads him through the darkness. He knows his path is not an easy one, but he is willing to walk it no matter how difficult it may be. And then Siba enters as if interrupting his train of thought. That's the way it is. Do you understand, asshole? His words sound like a throw of the gauntlet to fate, a challenge that cannot be refused. He is ready to support this battle because now their paths are intertwined by a common thread, the fight against an unknown threat. You had better swear to his words. Shiba inspires confidence and certainty. He's not just an associate. He's a reminder that there's no room for hesitation in this fight. He knows the value of decisions made here and now. Thanks, helped out, tossed Chihiro over his shoulder. Done, I yelled at him once. Words of gratitude are replaced with a joke, diffusing the tension, even in such a dark chapter of their story. Siba's irony is his way of fighting fear, his sword against despair, if only because traces of their activities began to appear about 4 years ago. That's right, they know about Hisyaku. The conversation turns to analyzing the problem, to trying to find the thread that will lead them to the origins of the darkness. Shiba and his Chihiro are not just allies in circumstance. They become a team ready to meet their enemy armed with determination and newfound understanding. Something vaguely about a small group of elite spellcasters, but nothing definite. Chihiro's words are full of bewilderment and uncertainty that they are dealing with forces beyond their comprehension. Shiba doesn't hide his irritation. And I'd really like to have concrete information. He wants understanding, he wants answers that could help them in this struggle. He tries to justify himself to Chihiro for his outburst. You don't need to add anything. Shiba realizes that every ally is important in these circumstances, and every harsh word could cost them the cooperation they so desperately need. Yeah, and yelling at him was unnecessary, said Chihiro calmly. Chihiro addresses his victim directly, his voice full of anxiety and pleading. What do you know about Hisaku? Tell me everything. It's no longer just a fight for survival. It's a search for truth in a world where every single piece of information could be the key to understanding the danger that threatens them. The fallen bastard, weighed down by the battle, struggles to choose his words. Shh. Okay, goddammit. His voice trails off. His eyes lose focus. He's on the edge of consciousness. But even in this state, he tries to convey an important message. These people, he begins, but his words are cut short. Chihiro, sensing the importance of the moment, urges him to continue, but the man is no longer able to say more. Chihiro, realizing the seriousness of the situation, addresses the bastard even though he's disgusted. Hello? But the man is still not breathing. Siba, realizing the need for action, proposes a plan. Brother, let's go get some air, shall we? He offers a rest, a chance to catch his breath and gather his thoughts to face the challenges ahead with renewed vigor. The man's eyes rolled back and he wheezed in pain, losing consciousness. The kid tried to shout to him, but it was already futile. The last drops of life were leaving the man's body. His eye began to roll strangely inward. The kid who had just been released from captivity was watching everything that was going on with interest and some fear. The protagonist ordered the bastard to immediately tell everything he knows. Suddenly the man's face began to deform in a strange way, the skin on it stretching as if something was moving underneath it like huge worms. Chihiro looked at the poor man in horror. He was screaming in pain, and it looked like he couldn't see anything. Shiba-san stood with his back turned to everything, not noticing anything. Suddenly he heard the cracking of wood and the screams of his comrades. Behind his back, a real drama was unfolding, as huge snakes, tree roots were ripping out of the man's body. They grabbed people and threw them in different directions. The roots were like giant snakes, which, smelling their prey, began to pounce on everyone indiscriminately. The poor fellow watched the huge roots of the tree coming towards him, and was resigned to the fact that he was about to be torn to pieces. His lips only managed to whisper one phrase. We. Suddenly, Shiba-san grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, and as if complimenting his phrase, he said, "They won't die," as if he had come to his senses and realized the horror of the situation. He tossed the poor man aside with such force that he flopped to the floor and rolled upside down on his ass. The man apologized for being so rude, but that wasn't what he had to think about right now. Lying in such a strange pose, he noticed that he was already in the street. The man asked if the guy was hurt by any chance. He was still trying to regain consciousness. Soon they were on the street. The danger had passed them by, but for how long? The guy thanked the man for saving them, and a little hesitantly asked who he was. In a cheerful voice, the man said, "Great." The guy was confused. Shiba turned to look at him and muttered to himself that this guy was still green. At this time, the poor man was trying to hold back his gagging as he struggled to comprehend what he had seen. Even though all the wizards lived in the city, but it was possible to meet someone like this in the countryside. Suddenly, the man remembered his partner, who at the time was furiously battling the distraught tree roots. Chihiro was standing in the house, shrouded in tree roots and chopping them with his sword. His face was still covered in blood and his eyes were staring into the void. A man remembered him and ran into the house screaming. The guy said it was pretty damn dangerous. After a moment's hesitation, he asked what happened to the guy they'd just rescued. The man said he was alive and well, just a little groggy. He was still thanking the kid for the miraculous rescue. It was clear from the protagonist's face that he was upset, only he had the opportunity to learn even more about the Hisayaku. The man said that a spell had been cast on this man. That's very considerate. But judging by the scale of the tragedy, it was done by a very capable enchanter. He gritted his teeth in anger, and once again a small opportunity to learn a little about his main goal eludes him. At this time, the man's face was already completely deformed by the huge infernal roots. It bore little resemblance to a human face. The skin was stretched and one eye was out of its orbit. All that reminded him that this creature had ever been human was his mouth. The room was already almost completely braided with huge roots that seemed to breathe. The man said he was planning to look into Tokyo. Chihiro said he would go with him. Suddenly the kid stumbled and Shiba grabbed him by the scruff of the neck to keep him from falling. This kid is pretty exhausted today. He can barely stand on his feet. The man looked at his companion with a concerned look. Despite the past 3 years, this kid has no combat experience at all. Although he is still far from wielding a magic sword. But this guy is already capable of handling such problems completely on his own. A small turret stood in the grass, and a bright yellowish light radiated from it. Rokuhiro's workshop and home was protected from the outside world by a barrier that prevented evil forces from sneaking in. And if something wrong happened inside him, Shiba would be able to know about it thanks to this barrier. The man shrieked as if he'd seen his own death. His eyes changed in an instant to a look of genuine horror. He stood in front of a completely destroyed house, the ruins of which revealed 2 silhouettes that were vaguely familiar to the man. And that thought pierced his heart like a sword. The bloody body of a man was lying on the ground. It was already hard to tell who it was. A vague guess pierced Shiba's brain from this. It was as if he had a chill inside. For a few more seconds he stood there, staring dumbfounded at the horrible picture, unable to move even a part of his body. Sitting over the bloody corpse of his father was Chihiro. The guy was still unemotional. He was completely covered in blood. Despite the horror of the situation, the guy remained calm. Shiba finally came to his senses and rushed to the boy's aid. He didn't seem to be paying any attention to him. It wasn't until the man came close that he turned his weary gaze on him. The man questioned the boy. "Is he all right?" There were a million thoughts going through his head. A man ran up to them and started asking the guy, what did she have going on here? The boy kept his hand on his dead father's chest, holding his sword to it. Inside him, it was like something had broken. Something very important. In a calm voice, the guy answered that it was the 3 spellcasters. His gaze was directed into the void, expressing nothing. Today, the man inside him had died. Several people stood in front of the blacksmith's bloody body, holding their weapons. They surrounded the man, who was already badly wounded and could not resist them fully. Suddenly, they appeared out of the darkness like ghosts. The little boy lay in the ruins of his own house, unable to move a finger. He was exhausted. He could not help his father, who now faced an unknown danger, and it was eating him up inside. Suddenly, one of the men raised a hand with a familiar tattoo. My eyes began to darken. my awareness falling into a dark, viscous void, stammering as if squeezing every word out of himself. The boy said he lost consciousness, and when he woke up, everything was already done. The man looked at him with frantic eyes and tried to understand what had happened in such a short time. He was standing next to a guy who was hugging the already cold corpse of his father. The man didn't know what to say. The situation was really terrible. During the war, the protagonist's father had made 6 magic swords. After the war was over, all the swords went back to his workshop and were hidden in the basement. Now, everything was destroyed, and it was very difficult to find anything that had survived. The man scrutinized the ruins of the house. Had all the swords really been stolen? Goosebumps ran down his skin. The man grasped the boy's shoulder and began to examine him to see if he was all right. Right now, the most important thing for him was to know that he was okay. "We should have called a doctor." In a heavy voice, with all his will in his fist, the boy said that it was nothing and that he was fine. At this point, his mind went blank, and he began to drift back into his childhood memories. He remembered the time his father took him to the basement and showed him some boxes. In them are magical swords. Each one has its own specific property, magical power. The boy watched his father proudly show him the results of his labors. After a little silence, he quietly said that this was the sword he should strive for. Hearing his son's reasoning, the blacksmith said it was quite possible. But let the boy remember something. Chihiro was alert and prepared to listen carefully. At the goat's hand towards the swords, the man said thoughtfully that all these swords could not be called a proper reference point. The man's voice was serious and ingratiating, looking at his son with a cold gaze. The father said that he should not admire the ability to create a strong sword. His gaze was cold and serious, but at the same time overflowing with paternal love and care, wanting to teach his son and pass on to him as much priceless knowledge as possible. Father kept talking. He said the boy should see the world with his own eyes. For what purpose and what kind of sword should he make? That's a question the lad must find the answer to through hardship. His father said that he too had been searching for the answer to that question day after day. And even after all these years, he had not been able to find it. Chihiro looked at him with a serious and seemingly soulless gaze. Grinning his warm fatherly smile, the man said that he would gradually gain their wits. The boy nodded his head and continued to look at his father with a seemingly expressionless gaze. He wanted to say something else, but he was too shy. Eyes downcast, the boy began to speak. His voice was calm and poised as ever. A little look at his father said that if he decided to have a serious conversation, he should have worn a more serious jersey. This t-shirt looks too carefree. The man's t-shirt had a round sun painted on it, and the words "sunshine is good." The man stared at his clothes in surprise. Does his son really think that of him? I mean, she's a badass. The boy replied that only his father thought so. Now all that came to mind was his father's bloody face. The dearest person in his life, who had been his support and encouragement all these years. Now he was all alone. Drops of already cold blood froze on the man's face, forming a crust. The guy still couldn't take it. Hot tears started streaming down his cheeks, and his voice started to break into a scream. Something very important had died inside him. Now in his heart, there was only emptiness and pain. Through his tears, stammering, he asked, who were all these people? Sheba looked at him with a tarnished gaze. He himself was overwhelmed with pity for the little boy. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to comfort the boy. Through his tears, the boy stammered that these people had no idea how serious his father was about those swords. There was so much pain in those words that no words in the world seemed capable of describing it. The boy grunted. His breath hitched and he couldn't say anything else. He was so overwhelmed by this grief that nothing existed for him now but the bloody corpse of the person he loved most. With eyes full of bitter tears, he looked at the ruins of his home, the place where he felt protected. Now there was only rubble. The picture of him and his father sitting at the table, his father making faces at him, and him looking at him with the same serious gaze. It was the warmest memory of his life. Tears flowed down the guy's cheeks. He couldn't hold back his emotions anymore. He had tried to be serious for so many years, but now he was broken. The only question that plagued him was, why did it have to be like this? He didn't understand why he deserved to be punished like this. Shiba-san also felt guilty about the incident. He apologized if he had caught up a little earlier. Perhaps this tragedy could have been avoided. The man agonized, but how could they even find this place? The guy didn't hear anything at all anymore, he just cried, going over in his memory all those moments that were for him the dearest in his life. He remembered that moment, and the very tattoo on the arm of the man who had taken his father from him. He remembered the sarcastic smile with which the bastard had killed. His eyes filled with rage. His breath came in quick gasps, and his heart began to beat with such force that he felt like it was going to fly out of his chest. Through his tears, he began to speak, vowing to himself. The boy gripped the sword in his hand even tighter. He must convey his father's beliefs to them. Those words seemed lost in the abyss, in the grief that had taken hold of the boy and seemed never to let him go. He looked down even more, and now he was staring forward with almost lifeless eyes. There were a lot of thoughts in his head, which he was trying to put in order. The wound on his soul had not had time to heal, and now he was reminded of his desire for revenge. From that day until now, nothing is known about Hiyasayaku. Not magical swords. He put his katana back in its scabbard. He thought with annoyance that he had just discovered some clue. And again, everything slips through his fingers. The boy thought sadly that it was not surprising that it was at such a moment that his father's sword was used for evil. But there was nothing left to do. It was necessary to solve this mystery and avenge the death of a loved one. He gritted his teeth and thought that he should find the Hisayaka and the rest of the swords as soon as possible. The kid was sitting on the windowsill looking at his katana. Small fish were flying in the air next to him. His soul was empty. His gaze was serious and calm. Outside the window, other houses of the big megapolis were shining with their windows. The pale white moon had already risen into the sky. Chihiro was sitting on the windowsill, contemplating his katana, when the door of the room swung open and a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. The large, tall hotel building towered over the rest of the city. Everywhere hung various advertising signs welcoming future customers, enticing them to buy a new, useless product. The black windows of the hotel looked at their future visitors. It was Tokyo, the city of nightlights, but the streets were still bustling with life. It didn't stop for a second. In the distance, the windows of high-rise buildings that looked like big beehives glowed. Shiba walked into the room and turned to the kid. He said that if he was still awake, they needed to go somewhere. Chihiro turned to him and asked what was wrong. With a serious look at the boy, the man said that they were in Tokyo at the most opportune moments. Finally, the man paused rhetorically, waiting for the right moment. The guy kept looking at his katana, the blade of the sword reflecting his face, full of determination and cold calculation. Beside him, fish swirled in the air. Finally, they were on the trail of the one who had seen the magic swords. This path would lead them to their father's enemies. The sword slid into its scabbard with a clap. An atmosphere of tension hung around. They must move out. There was no time to delay. As we all know, Japanese society is held together by swords. At the same time, allowing the possession of balls for self-defense contributes to the deterioration of public order. A respectable car stopped outside the hotel, from which several men in expensive suits got out. However, both Yakuza and important people from the cool business. There was a girl standing by the lockers talking excitedly. She was wearing a school uniform and a short skirt. The girl continued. She said that all these ranks of society desire a more effective means of self-defense. And here comes their hour. The girl's eyes lit up with anticipation. Many magicians from all over Japan gathered in one place. In Tokyo, there are over 1,000. This is where most of the magicians are located. The girl was standing by a news sign. Bringing the two sides together was her job, too. It was obvious that it wasn't the first time the girl had interacted with the most dangerous ranks of society. She looked at the sign that said in big letters, "Need information about the Hisayaki." There's a flame sign on her hand. It was a request from one of the regular customers, 3 years ago. Shiba looked at the girl and asked in a friendly way how was life. The girl's name was Hinao. In a cheerful tone, she replied that everything was fine. The girl noticed that the man had been gone a long time. What was he doing? He said that a lot had happened in the meantime. It was obvious that he wanted to share his worries. Smiling, the girl asked, "What are his plans now?" "There are quite a few lucrative jobs. He can work as a bodyguard for the Seiko company director, bodyguard to the chairman's daughter, mansion guard. The man interrupted her and said he wasn't looking for a job right now. The girl looked at him in surprise. After hesitating a bit, he asked the girl if she knew Rokuhiro Kunishiga. Hearing that, Kunao made a serious look. Of course she knows everything. Who does he think she is? The man continued his question. And does she know that he was killed too? His voice was still calm. They stood behind the bar, the man sitting on a small stool. The girl replied that she knew everything perfectly well. When she found out about it, she was so surprised. People say that the magical swords were stolen by some group and all that. There was interest in her voice. Suddenly she interrupted and with confusion asked, "What's the matter exactly? Why does he ask?" Shiba leaned on the table and began to speak. That's when she learned that this man was related to Kokuhiro Kunishiga himself. The news had changed her attitude toward the man. The guy's gaze was cold and serious. He looked through the man. His gaze hadn't changed in the slightest, only the desire for revenge. Hinao rested her head on the table. She was terribly bored. As usual, the only people who came to see her were the Yakuza and the powerful enchanters. She lay on the bar and tried to kill time somehow, to finish her work day as soon as possible. Suddenly, the reception bell rang. The girl had already greeted the new visitor, but she stopped half-heartedly. The doors opened and a small child was shown on the threshold. What was he doing here? Children were a rarity in a place like this. The city was lively. The nightlife was going on. Cars were whizzing back and forth. People were busy doing their own things. Huge posters and signs hung everywhere with colorful actors. The light of street lamps and car headlights illuminated the streets. In the stream of people, one couldn't even see their faces. Each of them no longer represented a separate individual, a boundless stream. This city, if you compromise even for a moment, it will be impossible to rise. The protagonists opened the creaky door and stepped inside. Shiba greeted the owners of the place with a loud cheer. Chihiro shivered, embarrassed for his companion. Hinao, standing behind the bar, ordered them to stop yelling. The two immediately fell silent. The sweet smell of spices wafted through the air. The atmosphere hadn't changed a bit since the men first came here. Turning to the newcomers, the girl said irritably that she was sick of these loud-mouthed men. Her face showed that she was not in the best of spirits. When she saw Chihiro, she waved at him. Had he decided to drop in on her today too? The girl could tell that she was happy to see them. Chihiro greeted her discreetly. She continued to demoniacally cheer. Apparently she didn't get many good visitors. She said, "This is really cool." The guy wondered, "Is that cool?" The girl walked closer to them. "Well, yeah, he comes here a lot." After a slight hesitation, the guy thanked her for telling him right away. His gaze softened a bit, so she's saying someone saw a magic sword. The girl nodded her head. It had been after all, and she was vacationing at their place now. On numerous shelves were frog figurines, cacti, and other things that were meant to create a homey coziness. Soon they came to the bedroom where a little girl was lying on the couch, sleeping sweetly. She didn't even notice those who entered her room. The boys looked at her in surprise. "That's some little girl." Chihiro glanced at his friend in surprise and asked, "Is this girl an eyewitness?" His eyes and voice were filled with disbelief. She shrugged her shoulders, and in her cheeky way replied that that was just the way it was. She came in and went straight to bed. Hinao stood behind the bar while the little girl who had just arrived at the cafe unceremoniously shouted her greetings as if someone was waiting for her. The girl, almost syllable by syllable, said that she had come because she had heard that you could hire a warlock here, as she spoke loudly, as befitted a young child. Remembering this, Hinao laughed. She squinted at her little visitor and, leaning on the counter, asked in a snide tone, "And what's her order?" Her voice was mocking. In contrast, the look of the little visitor was incredibly serious. She clenched her fists, and with all possible seriousness said that she needed protection. She was being pursued by a bad man. I could tell from the little one's face that she wasn't kidding, even though it looked pretty comical from the outside. Kneeling down in front of her, the hostess asked the young lady, "How much money does she have? After all, the services here are not free." The little girl replied with the same seriousness that she didn't have a dime. Hinao shook her head pretentiously. The little girl repeated all the actions after her as if mimicking her. From the outside, it looked like a little sister mimicking an older sister. Hinao smiled. She realized that this little girl and couldn't have money. After thinking for a while, the girl asked what kind of scoundrels were after her. After thinking for a bit, the little mysterious girl whispered. She tried to make her tone as mysterious as possible. Putting her index finger up, she said that this person had the strongest sword in the world. At this moment, he now thought that this little girl had definitely seen a magic sword. The guy stood beside her and silently thought, well, it's time to get to the bottom of all this. It's a strange story until they know the details. It's hard to say anything concrete. The girl looked at them in surprise. What are these two talking about? Sheba sighed out of a sarcastic tone. He said that he thought it was probably just a childish story. The strongest sword in the world, he chuckled at even the thought of it. Hinao was offended by this attitude. She was trying to help him, and he was acting like a real bastard. In fact, you shouldn't have trusted the words of such a petty girl from the beginning. Hinao puffed up even more. But they were the ones who asked to be informed in every little detail. There was resentment in the girl's voice. At this time, the little girl who was lying next to him whispered one word through her sleep. Hippo. Chihiro glanced at her in surprise. A hippo? What kind of nonsense is that? At this time, the little girl would keep mumbling in her sleep something about cell division. Is she talking in her sleep? I wonder what she's dreaming about. Does this child really know about cell division? But then the little girl woke up with a loud scream. Her face looked mad as if she had just had a nightmare. The girl got up and began to look with interest at those who had come and disturbed her sleep. There was a look of incomprehension and a touch of fear in her eyes. After thinking for a bit, the girl enthusiastically began to ask, who are they? Are they enchanters? Would they protect her? The man put his hand out in front of her and told her to be a little quieter before they needed to clear up a few things. The man squinted his eyes and said, first let her tell me why it was some rascal who was after her. The girl puffed up her cheeks and began to think hard. The man had put her in a stupor with his assertiveness. She looked at him with her wide eyes and did not say a word. Sheba asked in a loud voice, couldn't she think of anything? Quickly, she was splitting up. She should have been better prepared. At this time, the girl crossed her legs and looked at him with a wide smile. She was amused by this whole situation. And in fact, this is no place for her to play, so let her go home now. When she heard that phrase, she shook her head negatively. The man asked her in surprise, did she not remember the way home? After a little silence, she sadly replied that she had no home. In a stern voice, Seba-san asked, what about Dad and Mom? The girl's look was clear. Her eyes were wet and she was about to pay for it. Well, now at least it's clear that this girl is an orphan. Sheba sighed and looked over at the boy. After a moment's thought, he asked his companion if he could take this girl to an orphanage. Chihiro asked rhetorically, maybe they should have dinner. The little girl looked at her askance. You could tell right away from her look that she was very hungry. The answer to the question seemed to come to herself. The boy sat down in front of her and asked her affectionately if she wanted to eat. The girl just sat on the edge of the couch and looked at him with her big eyes. She wanted to say something, but she stopped short as her stomach rumbled. It was clear without further ado that of course she was hungry. She was so thin that it seemed she hadn't eaten for days on end. She waved her hands and told the boy that he could see it all himself, or rather hear it. Chihiro sighed heavily. And what kind of behavior this kid had. It looked like she hadn't eaten in a while. Sheba and Hinao watched her from a distance. The protagonist looked at the little girl with the calm gaze. He looked at absolutely every point. He asked her what she would like to eat. Tempura soba, shyly muttered the girl to herself. Suddenly the girl's eyes lit up. And as if she had thought of something else, she wanted to ask if she could do something else. But the boy interrupted her, saying that she had already made her choice. Sheba stood outside smoking a cigarette. His pensive face was turned forward. Behind him was a beautiful black car. The man was immersed in his musings. This kid really likes to take care of other points on his father had once trained himself quite well. Pictures from such a distant past surfaced in his mind. There was a plate of appetizing soup on the table. It was tempura soba. The smell of this dish spread throughout the room, making one involuntarily drool. As soon as the plate of food was on the table, the girl screamed with joy. A man in a chef's uniform approached. He bowed respectfully and handed the boy another dish. The boy thanked him. The little girl said her name was Shal. He looked at the girl in surprise. Time of introduction. Okay, then he said his name was Chihiro. Shal chewed enthusiastically on the delicious food. It had been a long time since she had eaten such a delicious meal. and now she was trying to savor every moment of it. The poor thing was living on the street, and she didn't have any money for a normal meal. The girl with her mouth full started talking. She turned to the boy and said that if he asked her if it was good, she would say, "Uh-huh." In a serious voice, the boy turned to her and told her that when she was finished, he would take her to the orphanage where she would have someone to play with. When she heard that, the girl, she looked at him as if she didn't expect such a setup. Almost crying, she asked, "So the guy won't protect her? Isn't this soup a sign of a contract?" She was almost crying. The boy lowered his head. He himself didn't know why this happened. But even Siba doesn't think this is her place to play. The girl pouted her lips and said in a serious tone that it wasn't a game. From this angle, she looked even funnier and cuter. The kid said in a serious voice to then tell her the reason why she was being hunted by a bad man. The girl started to speak, she immediately stammered. Realizing everything, Tahiro said that she hadn't made up her story yet, so she couldn't answer right. Shao shouted that it wasn't true. The guy started to devour his noodles. Shao replied that she just didn't want to answer that question. They were sitting in a restaurant, eating. At that time, another tall man came through the door and went inside, looking for a free table. Thinking a bit, the guy said then let her tell what was the strongest sword in the world. He needed to know at least something. Shao started talking with her mouth open, and she didn't manage to say anything intelligible, just a set of some incomprehensible sounds. The guy tried to hear her once, but nothing worked. Finally, he got through and took a sip. The girl said that clouds were flying out of that man's ball. Hearing this, the guy's eyes widened. It was as if he had heard something familiar. Oh, really? That kind of luck? It can't be. But she said clouds. It was hardly just a random guess. It was like a herd of goosebumps ran down the guy's back, about to get closer to figuring it out. After thinking for a bit, the guy timidly asked the girl, "Is it definitely not a game?" Shaw said in a serious tone that everything is for sure. It's not a game. After that, the kid asked another question. Did that rascal have a flame mark on the back of his hand? The girl hesitated. It was hard for her to remember. She said, "I think not," but she hesitated as if choosing words. At this time, the cook went to a neighboring table where the lanky man who had recently entered was sitting. The chef asked, "Isn't he going to order anything?" The stranger replied that it was none of his business and that he should leave immediately. When the cook heard this, he was indignant. He would not tolerate such rudeness. This is a noodle shop. If he doesn't want to eat noodles, then let him get the hell out of here. The cook was furious. Chihiro was engrossed in his conversation, but still kept his guard up. Who knows what might happen now? Leaning closer to the girl, the guy asked her, the one chasing her, was he Odin? At this time, an argument was going on between the lanky man and the cook. The newcomer said he was fed up with the cook. The girl said in a conspiratorial tone that he had many henchmen. Behind their backs, a real drama played out. The new visitor, enraged, jammed the chopsticks into the cook's throat with all his might. He began to wheeze, spattering drops of blood in different directions. The boy slanted his eyes and quietly watched the whole thing. At last he had a lead. So she had indeed hired herself a guard. The boy glanced at the corpse of the poor cook, who was lying on the floor, no longer breathing. 2 chopsticks were sticking out of his throat. Another cook saw this horror and shook with fear. There was a problem. The guy called out to the stranger, but he didn't even turn around. He only uttered a single word to Faraku. The man didn't even turn around. He had huge gold earrings in his ears. They were the kind worn by some shamans in ancient times. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a strange thing appeared that looked like a demon mask. Only the boy realized it was a time bomb. He had to act now, or he'd be blown to bits. There was a deafening explosion. The guy barely managed to jump out of the door at the last moment. A second later, the windows blew out from the powerful explosion, and people passing by began to cover themselves from the glass shards flying directly at them. The street was a mess. Everywhere were the household items that used to adorn the windows of the establishment. A guy was lying on the road a little far away, trying to catch his breath after such an incident. None of the people realized what was going on. What was this, a warlock? We should have run. They were stalkers after all. Shaw wasn't lying. That means she must have seen the sword she was talking about. I should have believed her right away. The boy, rising to his feet, apologized to the girl for doubting her words. and all around them was the devastation of the explosion. The place where they'd just been sitting was completely trashed. There was a huge hole through which another part of the street could be seen. The man who caused the whole disaster came out of the ruins of the cafe and with astonishment asked, "Is he still alive?" But that's the problem. In his hands he held a shawl which was dangling from a belt. The boy's gaze became determined. Now he knew enough to draw definite conclusions. A man was walking towards him in a casual manner. He was still holding the girl tied up. She didn't make a sound, just shaking with fear. Chihiro got into a fighting stance and prepared to attack his opponent. A plan of action immediately formed in his mind. First, the girl must be rescued, and then find out if this man was related to magic swords. The stranger held the poor girl tightly tied up. He said he only wanted the girl. He was not interested in the boy. The boy gripped his peelers tighter. One swing and it would be over. His movements are precise and quick. In an instant he had shortened the distance and was already very close to the stranger. It took him only a fraction of a second to cut the belt that restrained the little girl's movements. "Siba," he shouted, calling to his comrade for help. Now another fight would break out. It's not uncommon in this town. A man appeared as if from nowhere and picked up the girl in his arms, preventing her from falling to the hard ground. She didn't even have time to realize it. The man jokingly said it would feel like a bad one, but let her apologize. Realizing that his prey was getting away from him, the man rushed to catch up with the girl. There was no way he was going to lose her. At that time, Siba put Shal in the car with him. The girl had already realized that she was on the verge of death and had already started to scream. He stroked her head to calm her down. They sat in the interior of the car. For a second, they were safe. The girl was shaking with fear and flapping her big eyes. She couldn't say a word. Her breath came in gasps. She was so frightened. Finally, she came to her senses and looked at her savior. She asked him what the hell was that. The man glanced at her and mumbled to himself that she seemed to have regained her composure after 3 somersaults. "Oh yeah, how's she feeling?" The girl mumbled something unintelligible to herself. It was obvious that she seemed fine. With interest in her voice, she asked, "What did that just happen? Is this some kind of magic?" The man nodded. The girl resentfully said she wanted to be able to do that too. After a moment's thought, the man replied that she could master it too, if she worked as a cursed one. Apparently she didn't understand the expression and stared at the man with even more interest. He began to explain. He said that magic is built on meta-energy, the energy of human life. It slumbers in each of the humans and even in her. Shal tried to comprehend the essence of everything that had been said and looked under her shirt, as if trying to find something there that could explain everything to her. "Don't get acquainted," who wanted to steal the girl, quietly buried out of spite. He said that he would not repeat it, but would only say it once. His voice took on a fierce tone. The man yelled for the guy to give her the girl back immediately. His face contorted with a grimace and hatred. He really didn't like it when things didn't go his way. Chihiro calmly swung the ball and the magic carps reappeared around him. He apologized, but he had other plans for this. When he saw it, the stranger's eyes widened and his heart skipped a beat. He saw something he never expected. It was a magic sword, and now it seemed his life would be cut short. Sitting in the car, the girl looked at Siba with wide, big eyes and asked, "Is that a goldfish?" The man nodded and calmly replied that he, the man they were talking about, had what she said was the strongest sword. When energy is released, it takes shape. A magic sword can amplify meta-energy, but the human body can't generate and maintain that level of energy on its own. This goldfish is nothing but the embodiment of a power that surpasses the abilities of man. His gaze grew tired of explaining such complicated things to a small child. While they were talking peacefully, Chihiro was energizing his sword to finally finish off this scoundrel. This man deserved no mercy after all. He was hunting a little girl. The man was shocked. He to me just materializes energy outside his body like him. This guy is energy. It's a magic sword. There's another one. The man couldn't believe his eyes. It was the first time he had encountered such power. One more? The boy stopped and thought for a moment. So it was all true after all. Yes, the magic ball's inherent reaction is energy. He was standing outside the cafe building he had destroyed. He said he didn't think after 2 meetings with them they could come to an agreement. He put out his hands, and threw a lot of the very same bombs at the guy that he used to blow the cafe to smithereens. Dodging each hit, the guy asked him where was the second ball. The bombs were falling around him and exploding one after another, but he dodged skillfully. The stranger laughed. Of course he would tell him so. Chihiro continued to question him. He needed to find out as much information as he could about the swords. He asked, "So who had it now?" Surprisingly, the guy didn't lose his composure even in this situation. "What, he's this man's employer?" The guy dodged and jumped high into the air. The stranger laughed again. He called the boy a salaga. You only ask people questions like that after you've taken your enemy to the wall. And now they're on equal footing. But still, the man couldn't believe it. Is this the power that was rumored to end the war? It's impossible. In fact, it's not even possible. If it's only capable of slashing attacks, then its technique is no different from ordinary magic. The man squinted his eyes. The girl, she's still around, isn't she? Hope flashed in that thought. The man screamed, trying to reach the girl. He said it was a snotty girl just giving everyone a hard time. The man tried to put pressure on the girl's feelings so you would finally give in and give yourself away. He said protecting her would be the same thing. Just more people who died in vain. Let her watch. That's what will happen if she keeps running around calling others for help. The man kept shouting. He said it would be just like her mother died. Sitting in the car, the girl listened silently, tears welling up in her eyes. Sheba glanced at the frightened girl. He would have to try and calm her down now. Otherwise, if she cried, this freak would know their location and that would make it harder. The man moved over to her and stroked the girl's head. He could see that she was terribly frightened. He didn't know what had happened in this child's life, that she had been through so much adversity. But now, everything would be all right. The man's voice sounded calm and confident to give at least the illusion of safety. The man in the street continued to rage. He was shouting, trying to push his emotions, but he was doing badly, to put it mildly. He threw a few more bombs at the building. A few more loud explosions rang out. Chihiro bounced aside at the last moment. The man yelled that now this milksop's death would be imprinted on her memory forever. The death of her poor mother trying to protect her. The poor girl looked towards the explosions with frightened eyes and couldn't say anything. It was the worst thing to hear in her life. She tried to forget that moment, to erase it in her memory forever. Well, this incident once again made her go back to those horrible days too, and the man, all bursting with scream. He yelled that it was the most pointless and dumbest thing in the world. He threw a few more bombs, and the street was shaken by several powerful explosions. The girl looked out of the car window and called out to Chihiro, hoping to find him. In her voice, she could hear fear and horror at the hopelessness of the situation. And the unknown killer continued to rampage. He screamed and taunted, trying to lure the girl outside. He said she had no mommy or daddy now. Chihiro, at this time, had charged up his sword of energy and was now ready to deliver a crushing blow to already shut this freak up forever. Enough, this man is right. Questions should be left for later. Now is the time for action. The man gritted his teeth in anger. This guy survived. Does he have this kind of technique? That's impossible. The guy at this time silently jumped up and drew his sword to strike. He ran towards his opponent like a bullet. The man barely had time to dodge at the last moment. A second more and the boy's sword would have cut him in half. Still dodging, the man wondered. So this person isn't even using his strength to its fullest. That was really close. Just how strong is this kid? Well, if he's black dissecting on the fly again, then he'll have a couple trump cards in his pocket too. He threw some of his exploding bombs at the guy again. They were right under the guy's feet, ready to explode in a second. He had to bounce back at the last moment or he would die. Luckily, the guy had enough reaction to dodge, and he jumped high up, a huge explosion erupting below. Shards of stone, glass, and wood flew in different directions. Shao watched the whole thing with her mouth open in surprise. He had managed to dodge. She clenched her small fists, and her heart began to beat at double speed. The unknowing assassin had gotten a hold of the kid, instantly tying him up with his belt. Another second before he'd hook his sticky bomb on his back and finally finish him off. That's a shame. He had already prepared to carry out his execution. Chihiro was calm, his heartbeat steady and measured. His gaze was cold and calm and, as always, expressionless. The assassin had already prepared to detonate his bomb a few centimeters away from the kid's body when suddenly, the kid cast his spell. Furaku. The man didn't realize anything for the first couple seconds. It was his ability. But it was too late. The bomb exploded, vaporizing his face. It blurred like plasticine. Well, that's the end of that bastard. His redness isn't just a defensive gimmick. It's an absorption ability. Bounced off in time and took no visible damage. Shaw, wide-eyed with admiration, watched all of this. Shiba Said proudly. He told me that he had said everything would be fine. Chihiro bounced off and stopped nearby. There were puffs of dust around him. A few seconds later, a huge explosion sounded behind him. The building was now ready to collapse completely. The assassin who had just wanted to commit a massacre had become a victim. The car in which Shiba and the girl were sitting started up, and with a growl pulled up beside the kid, who was shaking off the dust. The car pulled up to him. The window opened, and the girl's delighted face appeared. Stammering and choosing her words, she said that the guy was just great. She was amazed. After a moment's thought, the girl said with an important look that it was Loy's time, and that she would hire him as her bodyguard. The boy looked at her in surprise and said that she didn't have a dime. How is she going to pay? The girl only snorted. He looked at her carefully. And yet this girl has no one at all. She's all alone. For a second, the boy felt sorry for her. He knew what it was like to be alone, but he already has a goal that is more important than anything else. And by fighting the pursuer, he is getting closer to it. The boy said that since their interests coincided so far, he agreed to protect her. The girl asked admiringly, "Is this really true?" She heard joy in her voice. She looked directly at Chihiro with big eyes. In a delighted voice, she said, "Yes, their interests are the same." At this time, Shiba was sitting behind the wheel, leaning on the door, and didn't say anything. It was clear from the look on his face that he was fed up. The guys concluded, so there's that. He wants to know 3 things. He walked over to the killer's barely alive body, which was still fluttering on the road. He threw him up against the wall and clutched his throat with his hands. The first question he wanted to ask was, who hired him? Why was it necessary to go after that girl, and another? The guy paused rhetorically. His gaze became even more cruel. There was no mercy to be had. He glared at him with his sizzling gaze. The last question he wanted to ask, the sword piercing the cloud, was, where was he? Soon they returned to the cafe to see Hanao. She was standing in her usual spot. Still, her information was useful. Alrighty. At this time, the shawl dressed as a samurai, and trying to imitate the fight she had recently seen, waved her arms in different directions. The guy sighed heavily and apologized for the inconvenience, and thanked her for her help. The girl asked, so why was the wielder of the magic sword chasing the little girl? Chihiro coughed and said in a sad voice that he would have liked to know that himself. In the background, the little girl had run out of breath after all, and now stood trying to catch her breath. The guy turned around on her. Shao was lying on the floor, curled up in a ball. She looked like she was in pain. Frightened, Hanao pulled her eyes out, and with a frightened voice asked what was wrong with her. The girl began to whimper that she was hungry. Laying on the floor, the girl said through her tears that although she had recently eaten soba, she had only had a couple of bites. Hanao said in a sad voice that she had nothing to offer. The shop had nothing left all over again. The guy sighed and said he was going to go to the store and get something to eat. He asked his girlfriend to look after the little girl. Hanao winked at him, and showing a thumb told him in a cheerful voice that she wouldn't let him down. Sitting behind the wheel of a car, driving somewhere. Houses and alleys whizzed past him. His eyes were focused only on the road. He clutched the steering wheel of the car tightly in his hands and drove it confidently forward. The kid was sitting on the ground trying to catch his breath. Shiba came up to him and asked if his arm was all right. The boy replied with a stifled expression that he was fine, even though he knew he wasn't. The man approached him from behind, and with irony in his voice asked him if he'd gotten too loose 2 times in a row already. He should control himself. The guy mumbled over his shoulder that he knew all that, and he knew it himself. Shiba was still holding the assassin by the tie in a serious voice, said that there was no way to be careless in such a case. He ordered the guy to return with the girl in his car and get a good night's rest, and he would take care of the freak himself. Chihiro looked at him with a devastated look. He must know something. There was a loud sneeze. There was no way out indeed. There needed to be a good rest after all the incidents. The boy and the little girl were in the car, sitting in the back seat, her head spinning in different directions. They were on their way home, and right now, the main thing on their minds was rest. Hinao picked up the phone and leaned it to her ear, listening intently. She greeted her interlocutor. On the other end of the line was Chihiro. In a serious tone, he said he was waiting for her to explain. His face was calm, but he was slowly boiling with anger. The girl said in a defensive tone that she was in the bathroom when he left. That's probably when she snuck out. The guy said he didn't mean how she got away. Why is she here? Smiling in a carefree voice, the girl said the little girl told her she wanted to go outside. Chihiro listened to her intently, the little girl sitting in the back seat and looking around the interior of the car with interest. They kept going, the car picking up speed. The houses whizzed by them, blending into a single line. And come to think of it, she's being chased by the enchanter, right? On the other end of the wire, Hinao continued to talk excitedly. She asked the guy what he thought. Who would be able to come after her? The boy thought for a moment. That's right, enchanter. And if he comes to capture her, will he blame her for everything? The boy answered firmly that he would not. Hinao said that it would be safer to go with a guy, even if she was lost in the crowd. She said goodbye, and the phone beeped briefly. Shal apparently noticed the change in the boy's face and asked him why his face was so gloomy. Chihiro replied menacingly that it was because of her and her pranks. He understands his friend perfectly, but he doesn't think wandering the streets is a good idea, even if she felt like it. There was anger and resentment in his voice. The little girl sat in the back seat, her eyes downcast and staring at the floor. She tried to say something, but she stuttered. Trying to justify herself, she said in a sad voice that she had been locked up for a long time. Besides, you don't have to be afraid to face the enemies, right? The little girl looked at the boy with a hopeful look. He would protect her, right? The boy was silent, and his eyes slanted to the side. A thought flashed through his mind. Locked up. The girl went on. Ever since she'd been caught, she had been, looking in the mirror with a serious look. The boy asked why would anyone want to catch her. There was silence for a second. The girl seemed to be searching for words. Chihiro asked, does she still not want to answer? Unless it's to protect her, she would at least like to know why she's being persecuted. Shal pouted her lips and wrapped herself even tighter in her clothes. She didn't want to answer that question. She remembered the scream of the murderer who had shouted her mother's death. That memory brought her unspeakable pain. The boy sighed and realized that he couldn't get an answer from the girl, so let her keep quiet. A little while later, he asked her if she was hungry. Hearing this, the girl perked up and in a cheerful voice said she wanted a bun. The murderer who had recently wanted to destroy the little girl was now a victim himself. He sat with his eyes down. His hands were bound behind his back with powerful chains, and he couldn't have broken free if he had wanted to. The chains gripped his wrist, causing pain. The man sat in a chair, completely stiff. This room smelled of death. Siba approached him with a loping gait. In a stern voice, he said that he was the one asking the questions here, so let him try not to get on his nerves if he wanted to live. The man pulled a chair over to him and began to sit down. He said in a thoughtful voice that this freak seemed to know the whereabouts of the magic sword. The bastard grinned and said he wouldn't say a word. Siba's hard foot had already stepped on his shoe and pressed his toes painfully to the floor. The man looked at him with a lifeless stare. It seemed like he could have easily taken his life at that second. Stupid excuses don't work. Let him tell what he knows. His voice sounded cold. His foot pressed even harder on the assassin's toe, and a slight crunch was heard. The bones crunched even harder, and the man clenched his teeth, trying to take away the pain. Shiba was adamant. He was determined to get all the information he could out by any means necessary. In an ingratiating voice, he once again repeated his question. Where is the magic sword? His face expressed calmness and at the same time, inhuman cruelty. This man could be an excellent assassin if he wanted to. After a moment's silence, the mercenary gritted his teeth and said that if he spoke, they would both be buried. It was obvious that the man was struggling to cope with the pain that came over him. Saiba's foot was already pressing so hard against the assassin's toe that the floor beneath it cracked. But the man was adamant. He warned him one last time in a voice full of pain to give the little girl up and mind his own business. Despite the inhuman suffering, a smile stretched across his face. There are forces at work here that surpass human comprehension. Shiba looked at him with a lifeless stare. He didn't seem to care about the man's words at all. Soon the car with Chihiro and Shal pulled up to a local eatery. It was already late at night, so there weren't many customers. The hungry girl, held a juicy bun in her hands now. She was ready to eat anything. The situation hadn't changed. The girl was still sitting in the back seat, clutching her food in her hands, the first tasty meal of the day. She said she was very grateful that the guy had saved her and fed her. In an emotionless voice, he said that was exactly how she should be grateful. There was a loud slurping sound. The girl took a big bite out of her bun and began to chew it diligently. Without turning around, the kid told her not to slobber on it and stain his parlor. Shaw was enthusiastically devouring the bun. It was insanely delicious. She couldn't contain her joy. Her eyes widened, and her mind was a veritable explosion of emotions. Right now, this bun was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten in her life. Without emotion, the guy asked, "So what's next? Are they going backwards?" No, they stopped again at the same diner. Looks like somebody didn't get enough to eat. Now the girl was holding an ice cream cone that was about to fall apart, icing dripping from it. The end of the meal should be marked with an end, the little girl said enthusiastically. Tasty dot. She held an ice cream cone in her hands and ate enthusiastically. How much food can this girl hold? The guy looked at her askance. So what does she call a dot? The girl wasn't listening to him anymore either. She was just eating. The guy said again to keep it down. She was so engrossed in the food that she didn't notice that she was covered in sweet frosting. She sighed happily. This was the most delicious dessert she'd ever had. Turning around, the guy over his shoulder told her to wipe her cheek. Then he asked tiredly, "Now are they finally going home?" Looks like the girl decided to make the most of the opportunity. And lastly, she ordered herself a large milkshake. Chihiro asked her irritably, "Hadn't she already set her mark?" The girl replied, letting the cocktail wash everything down deeper into her stomach. This girl was weird but funny. She started greedily drinking the sweet drink. The guy again wanted to tell her not to slurp, but she interrupted him. In a serious tone, as if she were speaking to the general public, the girl said that in confinement it was necessary to help her reach her stomach. He gave her a disgruntled look. Why so disgruntled? Yes, already having to take care of her. For all to see, the gang put another poor bastard on display. It was a horrible sight. There were a lot of people sitting around in traditional Japanese clothes. In the room was a pool in which a strange man was bathing. He was surrounded by many women. Suddenly the door opened and a few more people came in. Bodyguards, apparently. The man was unhappy about something. He had told everyone to keep it a secret. He turned to the man he was torturing and asked if he had given up following the girl and decided to come back. Even though he saw he'd failed, the poor man was bleeding. His eyes were gouged out with only black, bloody gaps in their place. He begged for death. The agony was so unbearable that only death could alleviate his suffering. His tormentor took a small shot glass from the table. He said, "And then there's that busy magic sword." Daruma still wouldn't have been able to handle it, but he had never heard of the goldfish ball. The man tilted the small bottle and began to greedily drink the contents. If what he said was true, then there are more than 6 magic balls. And why is the ball's owner protecting the little girl? There's so much he has to learn. Finishing his drink and sighing heavily, the man asked his subordinates if they had heard from the others. They nodded their heads in the negative. You could tell by the look on his face that he was dead drunk. His eyes were emotionless and there were large bruises under them. There had to be a change of style. They would act decisively. Shal finished eating, exhaled, and said that she had quite made it. Chihiro asked if she was satisfied with everything. There was a sneer in his voice. The girl looked away and looked somewhere to the side. There was no need for an answer. The boy could see that she was full. After a little silence, the girl said doomfully that her mother always told her to enjoy life. She looked out the window. But today she was overjoyed. Her eyes lit up with happiness. Even though she had to endure such a horror, the end of the day had brought a little joy. Chihiro listened to her half an ear and drove the car carefully down the road. The girl wanted to say something else, but she stopped half-heartedly. The traffic light turned red and the car's brakes whistled. The guy's phone started ringing off the hook and he picked it up. On the other end of the wire was Siba, asking where they were now. The man was worried about them, for the two had been gone for quite some time. Stopped at a stoplight, the kid replied that they were outside now. It was a long story to tell, so he would tell everything when we met. The man nodded to the unknown interlocutor and said he recognized their next target. Turns out their next target was Shogenichi, a well-known arms dealer all over Japan. a well-known figure in the underworld. Sitting in his secluded corner across from the former assassin, Siba said that it was the same man who hunted Shal. He was the one who hired this funny-looking pilaf lover. Face. He was already barely breathing, exhausted from the torture, and also found out an interesting detail. The cloud-piercing sword was from this particular merchant. The guy's eyes got serious. Something was starting to emerge. The cars were still standing at the light, ready to start. Their engines hummed and their headlights cut the night darkness with their bright light. Shal wondered where they were going. It's green. The girl's eyes were filled with incomprehension. The guy kept talking on the phone and as if he didn't notice the world around him. Judging by the words of this mercenary, and considering he had a magic sword. The conversation went on for a while. Surely this man knows something about Isayaku. The car wanted to start, but its wheels were stuck in something and just spun in place. It was impossible to move out of the way. The road formed into a strange hydrogen. The asphalt floated, sucking cars into itself. Something strange was happening. Chihiro didn't seem to be paying attention as he continued to talk passionately on the phone. The little girl flipped upside down on her butt with a violent jolt. Shiba said that he had now called Hinao and asked her to find out about this man. They were to meet at her bar and then they would decide what to do next. He'd get some more details now and then he'd go there too. From the whirlpool that suddenly formed on the road, a strange creature made of many fused human bodies began to appear. From afar it looked like a huge human millipede. Its arms and legs were sticking out in different directions, and its faces were blurred. A shapeless something directed its exhausted eyes right at the car where the main characters were sitting. It's like it found something. Finally, the kid finished talking on the phone and turned his attention to the horror going on outside the car windows. He grabbed his swords. A fight was coming. Trouble was following them the whole way. Someone clearly didn't want them to get home alive. Well, these were clearly non-local townspeople. Chihiro glanced at the monster that had just emerged from the asphalt. The little girl was sitting in the back seat, even afraid to move. For a second, the guy thought. The girl didn't even get out of the car. Hardly anyone would have recognized her on the street. At this time, the shapeless something began to split into a multitude of human figures that rapidly began to move towards the car with the protagonists. An incomprehensible black substance began to flow out of all the other cars. The people sitting in the cars began to dissolve as if they had been poured acid. The doors began to open and this black filth poured out of them. The windows of the protagonist's car shattered, and the black stuff came inside, enveloping bodies at an unspeakable rate. The boy tried to shake them off with his hand, but it was too late. The man who had caused the creature stood in the road and watched his creepy creation devour the car with every passing second. Chihiro went forward and knocked the roof of the car off with a single blow. The boy jumped out just in time. He would have fallen victim to the creature if he had been a second longer. At the same time, he grabbed the little girl in his arms. He landed a few meters away from the stranger. The one looked at him with interest, and there was the magic sword. Chihiro looked at the stranger readily. He certainly didn't wish them well. The man at this time began to speak. He said, judging from the look on his face, the guy must be surprised. The thing is, both of them are now famous personalities. The man had a face covered in tattoos. From afar, it appeared that his eyes were completely black. He kept talking. Literally, just now, a man named Sojo announced to everyone but the guy with the scar and his magic sword. At that time, the TV started broadcasting the news with a familiar face on it. As soon as Hinao saw Shal's face on the TV screen, she was very scared. The man kept talking. He said that his employer said that he would pay any amount to whoever brought him the sword and the girl. This case sucks. Something had to be done. Hinao ran out from behind the counter and started frantically running around her bar. At this time, the unknown assailant said that the man who hired him was very respected in this city. Everyone in the world of shady business knows that. Hinao was horrified. For a moment, the thought flashed through her mind that now all the enchanters of Tokyo would be after these two. Chihiro pulled the girl tighter against him and told her to hold on. She just nodded understandingly. The girl realized that right now she needed to trust this man completely. The guy jumped a great distance and started trying to get away from this stranger. The one followed them with his black eyes and shouted that they would not get away. In a single hand movement, he ordered his monster army to move out and catch those two. The people, who had already become some substance in the meantime, began to move, emitting long groans. Chihiro held the girl tightly in his arms and ran as fast as he could. He turned the nearest corner, hoping to escape his pursuers. But they didn't lag behind. A whole crowd was already running after him. People were rushing after the guy, their bodies merging into one big stream. Chihiro stopped a few meters away from the mass of people running towards him and swung his sword, preparing to use the spell. One swing of the sword and the group of people was cut in half. The upper part of their bodies separated from the lower, along with their heads in an instant. A wet crunch sounded and the shredded bodies fell to the ground, splattering dark red blood. The guy looked at them obliquely. Even from the cut they don't die, did he make puppets out of clay? The man was already standing beside the boy, ready to attack again. The sword, once during the battle, he had seen its true power with his own eyes. The power of this weapon ended the hell that reigned on Earth. Therefore, he is calm. The man spoke in an emotionless voice. He said, right now, the guy doesn't possess the power of all 6 balls. Chihiro wondered, is this man a war veteran? The man kept talking, as if to ignore the boy's surprise. He said that besides, he was too inexperienced for the owner of such a ball. All in all, he doesn't stand a chance. The puppets rose from the dead. Their bodies fused together again, and they rushed straight at the kid with a new flow. He realized these things are endless. We have to get the real one. Chihiro swung his sword, cutting down the hordes of creatures one by one. He held the girl tightly in his arms, preventing the puppets' hands from even touching her. At this time, there were more and more of them. They endlessly approached the two and stretched their cold hands towards them. His gaze was cold and calculating, his actions as precise as a bullet. Something had to be done about it, or they'd be torn apart. The memory flashed back to when he was sitting with his father at the table, and they had a complete family idea. Rokuhiro said with a happy smile on his face that tonight's dinner looked delicious too. The picture in his memory shifted, and in front of him was once again his bloody father, who sat at a table that had scraps of blood and flesh on it. The moments of normalcy intermingled with the horrors of death. He sat over his father's corpse, completely devastated. He asked himself, how many hours has it been? A voice answered him that only 4 seconds had passed. The guy's face was completely exhausted from suffering. He fell to his knees, me gathering the remnants of my strength into a fist. The figure of a stranger towered over him. Wryly, he asked, does it seem to him that it's been too long, right? The puppets were getting bigger and bigger by the moment. One of them had already snatched the little girl out of the guy's hands and was holding her by the scruff of her neck. The creepy voice kept talking. Did he think he could get around town quietly in a car? It was a long shot. Shawl dangled limply in the hand of one of them. Saliva dripping from her mouth, the girl was out of it. The creature blurted out a smile. He said that its ability to pick up the fluctuations of consciousness. It can locate a person based on the signals emitted from their brain. And then, coming closer, he can, as now for example, resurrect the painful scene in the mind. Chihiro struggled to get to his feet, but his strength was leaving him. Wryly, the stranger said that it was normal. He dug around in his head, and it's a perfectly normal reaction. One of the puppets was holding the poor girl tightly by the scruff of her neck, just dangling like a puppet. This girl, the last of the Kyonaga family. One of the puppets approached her master and asked in a wait-and-see tone if he could eat her. The man called his slave a fool. He needs money. Besides, if he eats the flesh of any of the girl's kind, it will make him eternally young, and then he can blame himself. The slave asked in surprise, did all of them die because of this peculiarity? The master nodded affirmatively. At that time, taking advantage of the momentary confusion, the boy reached for his sword. The puppet continued to hold the girl and asked with interest, but why did Shoujo need her? The man reached out his hand in an attempt to take the child. He grasped her little foot, squeezed it out of strength. The pain spread throughout the little one's body. Blood splattered in different directions. The girl screamed in pain, and the man merely stared at her in surprise. Blood dripping on the cold, wet asphalt. The boy struggled to get to his feet to end this nightmare. It pained him beyond belief to see a small child being abused like that. At the place where the girl's broken leg had just been, it was instantly fused together. The muscles intertwined as if forming the roots of a tree. The puppet looked surprised at such an amusing sight. Her wound had completely healed, a hallmark of any of the Kiyonagi family. In a second, the blood had already clotted and the skin had healed. But they didn't understand why Sojo needed this child. Should we use her? The master replied that who knows, one thing is certain, this girl is unusual. By the look on the little girl's face, she was stammering, but she couldn't say a word out of pain. Naturally, this girl is far from a quiet life. Restless, poor thing. The man raised his bloody hand and brought it up to the girl's face. In a sarcastic tone, he told her not to be offended by her blood. Suddenly, the man stopped talking and looked at his bloody hand in surprise. He wished he could live a full life like her. The sword must be taken away, too. He bent down and grasped the hilt of the katana. Chihiro was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his face as he tried to rise. The puppet pointed his finger at the crying girl and begged his master to let him interrupt her life. Suddenly, something happened that no one expected. The girl had already resigned herself to her fate and was only whimpering quietly in the hands of this monster. From behind, in the blink of an eye, a bloody drama was unfolding. The boy still managed to get to his feet, and he shouted for the bastard not to touch the sword with his filthy hands. The man didn't even have time to react before the guy pulled out his second sword and swung it at him. Chihiro swung his katana, fending off the man's blow. The man looked at him in surprise, and a calm voice told him to hold still, that it would be over now. His eyes widened. He didn't understand. How could this be possible? After all, this guy had just been in a half-dead state. In an instant, Oka's katana severed his arm and his pelvis fell to the ground with a wet sound. That very day became for the kid the source of his strength. And now that freak had made him even brighter. Chihiro held tightly onto the handle of his ball, his eyes glittering with rage. Now he would avenge all his suffering. There was the sound of a ball cutting through human flesh behind the puppets' backs, and blood began to pour out. The man let his eyes bulge in horror, but there was nothing more he could do. His fate was sealed. He didn't even have time to say his last dying words. At this time, one of the puppets was still firmly holding the girl by the scruff of her neck, not even noticing the bloody events unfolding behind her back. The guy jumped to his feet and with one powerful blow chopped several of the freaks in half, severing legs, arms, and heads. The blood vortex began to swirl around, filling the entire space with liquid metallic air. Blood poured out in rivers, human remains flying everywhere. The puppeteer glared furiously at the guy who had suddenly risen from the dead. His eyes filled with madness, he shouted that if the guy just tried that, he would finish the girl on the spot. But he didn't have time to do anything. As soon as his hand touched the little girl's face, there was a loud crunch, and the hand was easily separated from her body. Shawl was left standing on the ground. Blood splattered around her and the severed arm of her tormentor. She didn't even have time to realize now her life was in no danger. She knew how to hide her ability, and she never wanted to talk about it. Was she afraid he might want to use her power too? The boy knelt down in front of her, and his voice became calm and good-natured. The girl nodded. In her heart, she was still afraid of the inevitable. But in the end, she decided to tell him. The boy was staring exhaustedly away, trying to get his thoughts in order. Now the girl wanted to trust him. He took her in his arms, and she nodded accordingly. He looked down on her with a kind of concern, like an older brother guarding his little sister. She has a voracious appetite, after all. The little girl said she threw it all up. Smiling, the guy said she could have his portion. He set it aside for later and thought about grabbing a bite a little later. He handed the little one the food and apologized for letting her be in that situation. You can't put that child in danger. The girl accepted the gift and said in a tired voice that it was nothing. She still had fear in her eyes, as if she were reliving those terrible events all over again. The guy shifted his gaze to his unwound car. It had been completely destroyed by the slimy slime. It was no longer possible to use the car. He threw the girl on her back and so tightly she grasped her arms around his neck. We need to get out of here soon anyway. But still, it wasn't that simple. They wouldn't be able to leave so easily. As soon as the protagonists went in the opposite direction from this place, an unknown figure appeared in the depths of the dark tunnel. It was 5-1 of the mercenaries sent to kill them. He had the mask of an ancient Japanese demon on his face. With joy in his voice, he told himself that his employer would give him a large sum of money if he could catch them now. Another man was approaching them from the other side. They were trapped again, and now they had few escape routes. Chihiro stood there, looking at one or the other. The girl wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed herself against him. A tense silence hung in the air. Something terrible was about to happen again. In this short time, the friends had gotten used to being hunted constantly. Slowly, two unknown figures approached them. The boy clenched his teeth in frustration. Here we go again. The stranger was already approaching him from behind. A man wearing the mask of an ancient Japanese demon suddenly snapped out of his seat and ran at them with tremendous speed, cutting through space. He jumped high into the air, preparing to attack. His fists began to burn with fire. Chihiro quickly turned around and grasped the hilt of his sword. Another battle was about to begin. Suddenly, he was stopped by a guy who appeared right in front of him out of nowhere. He grabbed his arm and told him to hold his sword. Not a fraction of a second later, the mysterious stranger jumped up and with all his might kicked his attacker right in the jaw. There was a viscous sound of impact. The stranger in the demon mask noticed that this person is fast. Who is this person? However, he doesn't use magic. It's just ordinary agility. The other attacker folded his arms in a prayerful gesture and began to cast a spell while the guy jumped high up, hitting his accomplice with tremendous force. The man had no sooner finished the spell than the stranger extended his long arm toward him. The long-haired boy was there in a flash, and with great force he punched the man right in the stomach. The man in the demon mask was just stunned, watching it all from the side. Stunned as he watched his accomplices being slaughtered, he didn't understand how he got such dexterity. Suddenly he looked up, and the sign looked vaguely familiar. The unknowing savior jumped up again, and was already swinging his fist to destroy the man who was reading the spell. He struck his opponent with such force that blood flew in different directions and bones cracked and began to break one by one. The man smiled and folded his fingers in a strange gesture. At that time, the unacquainted masked demon shouted for him to stop. He put out his hand, raising it up to show that he was disarmed. In a doomed voice, he said that this time he surrenders. This guy's in plain clothes, he's probably below colonel. After saying that he did not want to oppose the state, the criminal disappeared from sight in a flash. No one even noticed how he had escaped. The stranger exhaled lightly, and transferring his gaze to the stunned boy, said that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Strangely, the man knew his name. It turned out that they had known each other for a long time. Chihiro looked at him and thanked him for his help. The unknown savior. His name was Azami. Shawl peeked out from behind his back and looked at the stranger with a wary, frightened gaze. He didn't even need magic. Who was this? The guy spread his bloody hands and said cheerfully that things were taking a nasty turn. He had already exceeded his authority by a lot, so let them get out of here as soon as possible. The protagonist thanked his comrade once more and asked if his hand was okay or his arm. The girl would still be looking out from behind his back and asked in surprise, "Who is this man?" The man looked at his hand. For him, it was as if it was a common thing. Chihiro answered the girl's astonished question. He said that he was an ordinary enchanter, but he was the kind who dealt with the Yakuza and organized groups. The guy still realized he was seriously wounded, and staring at his hand, he screamed in pain. Soon they came to a familiar place. It was the same bar where Hinao worked. After all that they had been through, they needed to rest and recuperate. They opened the creaky door and went inside. Azami had already bandaged his hand and stopped the bleeding. When he entered the room, he greeted the hostess and asked how she was doing. Shiba was already sitting there leaning against the bar. Azami greeted him too. The man only mumbled something to himself. It was obvious that he wasn't happy to see this man. Hinao looked at the newcomer in surprise and asked, "Did he come to protect Shao?" The girl looked at them with incomprehension. She didn't understand what was going on here, and why there was so much attention to her person. Shiba glanced at his comrade, and with a disgruntled look asked if he had already found out about her. The boy answered in the affirmative, and he wanted to tell his comrade about what had happened to his car, but he stopped half-heartedly. Azami clocked the back of his head, saying he would have gladly protected her, but he blanched half-heartedly. Since the war, since the Kamunabi came along, their purpose hasn't changed, to eliminate any threat to the state. Shiba grimaced and mocked him by repeating his phrase. "Don't they care about private problems?" The man said angrily that it was better for Azami to get involved. Shawl perked up. In a cheerful voice she asked, in that case, would she stay with Chihiro? Hope could be heard in her voice. The girl jumped up from her chair and adopted a mock fighting stance, showing off her fighting attitude. This brought a smile to the men's faces. Shiba said that this girl was very happy. The guy asked, Does he think that's what joy looks like? Sitting behind the bar, the man asked his acquaintance, "Why did he come?" Azami replied in a calm voice that he was ordered by his superiors, because Sojo announced a bounty on the heads of those two. The guy pointed towards Chihiro and Shal, who continued to rage. Azami approached Shiba and said with a firmness in his voice that he really hoped the man would tell him about their future plans. The man stared at him contemptuously. The one continued as if nothing had happened. He was very curious about the existence of Chihiro and the seventh sword. Even the top Kamunabi know. Only those who had helped Rokuhiro retire. There was a certain mystery in the man's voice, and he tried to speak in a whisper. Chihiro turned away and listened to them with half an ear. The man continued, "Turned out to be unknown, in whose hands magic swords are also considered a threat to the state. And his main task is to collect all 6 swords. For some reason, the situation around Chihiro's person was not publicized even among the upper classes." The boy hesitated, his gaze drooping. Azami continued talking. "But if he keeps drawing attention to himself, then even a person like Azami were able to cover him, especially if he uses his sword in the middle of the street." Inside the cafe, there was an atmosphere of tension. Azami turned to Siba again. He said that the man should promise him that he would control the boy. Thoth. It seemed like he wasn't even listening to him. Sarcastically, he replied that now was the most convenient time for that. Apparently hearing their conversation, Chihiro, what did they mean? The man nodded his head at him and told his friend that he could see for himself. "This guy is ready to fight." Chihiro sat silently, staring at a single point. His gaze was as focused and serious as ever. The fact that he can handle a magic sword is proof of the result of his work on his body and soul. A mere amateur would not be able to handle such a sword in 3 years. Shiba said that sooner or later the whole truth would come out. Didn't he already think this guy would spend his life quietly gathering information? Azami of the Big Bangs. Besides, the situation would now unfold much more rapidly. Shiba said that he also investigated and found out some things. And by the way, could the reason for Azami's business trip be exactly what he thinks it is? It was a rhetorical question. Still interested, the kid asked them what they were talking about. Azami was shocked. How did this man know everything? After all, he had kept himself carefully hidden. He seems to have realized there's no point in hiding now. In a month's time, the annual auction will be held, bringing together all the bigwigs of the underworld, the Rakuzaichi auction. It'll be very crowded, so it won't be hard to get lost. Rokuhiro Kunishiga's sword True Strike will be on display there. The man hesitated as if trying to find the right words. And the seller of this sword is the very man thereafter. The unknown male served his hands in a lock and ordered Sojo to report the situation to him. The man asked him again. They were standing in a strange upside-down house. Was their meeting then that necessary? His greasy hair came down over his haggard face, and his eyes were still without the slightest drop of life. He said dryly, everything was going according to plan. So okay, it was over. Chihiro sat there thinking, Shujo. Not only does he have a piercing cloud, but he also has a true punch. It's silly to assume that he has no connection to the Hisayaku. Sojo has been at the top of the Kamunabi blacklist for over a decade. However, he still continues his activities in the underworld. He's witty and cautious enough that they can't take him down easily, thanks to his combat experience. Azami turned to the guy and said in a serious voice that it was too early for him to go up against this man. He would have very little chance of winning. Azami's subordinates just destroyed all the APBs on them, so they won't be looking for them for a while. The man looked at him sternly. This guy had really grown a lot. But judging from the tremors in his hands, he's still not strong enough. Therefore, let him leave Sojo and the auction to them. The boy nodded his head in agreement. Inside, he was still eager to get involved because that was why he had worked so hard to get here. Azami immediately realized that the guy was lying and didn't even blush. Shiba asked him, why did he say that if he knew it wouldn't work? If he wants to stop Chihiro, let him take the sword away from him. Azami handed the phone to Shiba. As he left the bar building, he said that there had been several other incidents with the Hisayaku besides the killing of Rokuhiro. They've never acted so decisively before. Apparently they're up to something that requires magic swords. I'm sure they're going to stir up the whole country again. There was still a month left until the end of the auction. The man opened the door and prepared to leave. In parting, he said that Chihiro should be well prepared if he still wanted to participate. The boy's eyes were still as serious as ever, but now he was filled with fury. He was only a few steps away from avenging his father. A moment from his childhood surfaced in his mind. His father had enthusiastically suggested that he play a game. It was sudden. "What the hell kind of game is this?" The boy looked perplexed at his father's enthusiasm. "It was a game in the truest sense," the man replied. "What kind of game?" The man pointed with his hand to the fish tank and said they had to figure out which one they liked best. The man continued to speak excitedly. "Legends say that if a goldfish is attached to a man, it will swim to his hand when he puts it in the water." Chihiro, along with his father, stuck their hands into the fish tank. They immediately swam up to the boy's finger, though he didn't even have time to fully immerse it in the water. The guy said it's not surprising at all since he's the one who feeds them. And he changes the water too, so they'll love him more. The man pulled his hand out of the fish tank and wove his teeth irritably. In a game like this, there's no need to congratulate the winner despite the bitterness of defeat. Well, it was time for them to get to work. It had been a long time and they were still idle. Shiba thought since the Kamunabi were involved, Sojo's representatives would probably leave them alone. However, it would be better for them to stay off the streets for now. They could work out a plan of action here, so Chihiro could rest for a while, and Shao would be safe. The boy gripped his katana even tighter. The words came to mind again. They must be up to something that they need magic swords for. The boy sat and thought. The phrases he had heard during the dialogue popped up in his head one after another. It was too early for him to confront him. Suddenly, Shao started talking in her sleep again. The guy sat on a chair and paid no attention to anyone. The girl had already fallen asleep and was mumbling in her sleep something about meatballs and seaweed. She was talking about tangerines and suddenly she blacked out. Her voice was weakened and sleepy. Hinao asked, surprised, "Has the girl fallen asleep already?" The boy nodded his head, but apparently in her sleep she plays word games and loses. He apologized to his friend Zato for having to hide them. There was a sign on the door of the bar that said an inventory. Smiling, the girl said it wasn't a problem. She could help them with that. A man with an elongated face and sharp features stood talking on the phone. His name, Madoka Isayaku. He had a nickname of Daruma. His trademark Darumas could blow anyone up, that's why they called him that. He's a high-ranking sorcerer who's a killer who never fails. But all this was only until recently. He remembered sitting in the ruined barn and enduring the torture. This time he was finished. The thought flashed through his mind like a bolt of lightning. Siba looked at him with a contemptuous look and suggested he change his lifestyle. Daruma looked up with exhausted eyes. It was impossible to do such a thing at once. His family won't accept him for who he is anyway. Remembering his mother's face, who angrily asked, "Does he think he can just go back? He's the reason they're called a family of maniacal bombers." The woman didn't want to see him on her doorstep anymore. Daruma lowered his head. He fell silent as if recalling a passage from his past life. Shiba looked at him with his trademark stare. It was surprising to him too, since he was still capable of such a facial expression. Shiba thought that he could still change. Not all was lost yet. But who knows? He might be wrong. Daruma remembered those moments with some warmth. Lastly, the master gave him some advice. Sitting on the bed of his room, he picked up his cell phone and dialed his sister. An irritated female voice sounded in the receiver. The girl recognized him at once and said that it was nighttime. He wanted to apologize to her, but she said goodbye and wanted to hang up, but the man stopped her. Every word seemed to come to him with inexpressible difficulty. He said he would be different. He would change. His large earrings lay in the trash can. In a heavy voice, he said he would no longer live as an enchanter. The woman asked wryly, "Does he really think that's the only reason he should be forgiven for everything he's done?" The man replied that he didn't think so, so he intended to prove it with actions. It may take time, a long time, but he wants to redeem himself. There was genuine remorse in his voice. The woman on the other end of the phone was quiet for a moment and asked if he had called his mom. The man replied that yes, he had called several times, but she had not answered once. He apologized to her over and over again. No wonder it's nighttime. The man asked. Maybe then he should go to her in person in the morning and apologize. There was a family photo on a shelf nearby. The sister agreed. She was going to see her herself. Well, now she would pick him up too. Daruma, with a bandaged leg on crutches, was approaching his sister's car. He was determined to change his life. As of this day, the enchanter is dead. Now he must go through a long journey of rebirth to finally become human. He smiled, looking toward his sister out of warmth and gratitude. He swore to himself now that he would become a different person. But his plan was destined to come true. It didn't take half a second for his sister's body to turn blood red, and sprays of scarlet liquid flew in different directions. The man looked at it in surprise, not yet fully realizing the horror of the situation. A few seconds later, and his body pierced by a long, sharp sword, the man wheezed in pain. He didn't understand how he had been found. His sister had nothing to do with this. The man who suddenly appeared in the back seat of the car said that their deaths were payback for the Daruma not doing his job. Them? A gruesome guess popped into the man's head. A small trickle of blood was already running from his mouth. Suddenly he thought with horror of his mother, the dearest person in the world. The man was horrified at what could have happened to her. A dollop of explosives started coming out of his mouth. He was wheezing and saying he wasn't just going to die. He'll take him to the other side too. He didn't have time to say his phrase as his mouth began to deform. The stranger opened the car doors and got out with ease. Closing the door behind him, he left the poor man inside. His bones crunched and his body gradually deformed even more. He was no longer human. The pain was unbearable, but there was nothing he could do about it. That stranger was Sojo. He walked away from the car, wiping his sword clean of blood. The woman behind the wheel is unconscious, but still alive. He put his sword back in its scabbard, and this idiot, always inconsistent in all things. Since he had chosen his life path, the man paused. Let him follow it to the end. The sword hid in its scabbard, and in the car, the man's body was further distorted by the monstrous doll. He was no longer human, but only a shell from which a monstrous creature was bursting out. In the end, he shouted that he would take him with him. Not even a few seconds later, a massive explosion shook the area. A tall column of flame began to rise. Filling the entire space around with the acrid smell of smoke was destroyed. Sojo was walking away and didn't even turn back. His brother that he has a great psychosensitivity. You can tell it's his little brother. Does he remember that the enemy must be driven mad and then killed? He replied that of course he remembers everything. The man squinted his eyes and said that the current object seemed to have a magic sword, but he would still make him feel his own powerlessness before striking, and let the other one just watch from the sidelines. Sojo agreed with that as well. There was another guy standing in front of the man, looking at him with an uncomprehending stare. So they wanted him to finish his brother's job and kill the guy with the scar. Sojo had already grabbed his sword. A chill ran down the boy's back. He was only bringing information. Why kill him? The maniac's eyes glittered predatorily. For the sake of what was about to happen, he needed to warm up. He grabbed the poor man by the neck and dragged him behind him. The boy could not do anything. The man's grip was incredibly strong. He could only accept his unenviable fate. His eyes burned with madness and his mind was in a monstrous veil. Now he was no longer a man. He had only one thing on his mind, a lust for murder and blood. He remembered moments from his deep childhood when he stood in a field dotted with flowers and human blood dripped from above. There were the bodies of many murdered and mangled people. The maniac's eyes glittered. It felt like an eternity, but in reality it was a few seconds, and his question sounded like a thunderclap. He held the poor boy by the neck. He was barely breathing. His eyes rolled out of his orbit so much that he looked like he was going to burst. His fate was sealed. At this time, the town was living its life. No one would have noticed the death of one little man. Around the corner, a man came out of a dark alley with a ball in his hand. A human body lay in the depths of the dark passage, bleeding. The poor man was no longer breathing. Sojo strode confidently away from the spot. His target was very close, only a few meters away. The people passing by didn't even seem to realize what kind of monster was wandering among them. He grasped the doorknob and pulled it toward him with a sharp pull. When he entered the cafe, the people present did not even immediately realize who was standing in front of them. Everything happened so fast that the brain did not have time to adapt to the rapidly developing events. The man lunged at them with the ball, but the guy reacted in time and blocked the hardest hit. He pushed the girl aside in an attempt to protect her. Their swords crossed in a martial dance. The sound of metal clashing began to be heard everywhere. The boy opened his eyes, and for a second he realized that this was the very man he had been hunting all his life. Sojo started applying the piercing cloud. The kid told everyone to run as far away as possible if they wanted to live. Shaw looked at it all with a frightened look. She couldn't move in a finger. A little girl was walking down the street toward the cafe building. The building was almost completely destroyed. Sojo stood near the hole in the wall, holding his bloody sword. He was surprised the kid wasn't dead. He had heard that he could fight another magic sword wielder here, so he showed up in person. On the way, Shao met Hinao. Upon seeing her, the girl grabbed the little girl by the shoulders and ordered her to hide immediately. Shao quipped and said that that's where Chihiro stayed, but what about him? There was blood dripping from the sword. From afar, the guy asked the man, "Is he Sojo? Does the blood on his sword belong to a villain?" Sojo said in an indifferent voice that he wasn't interested. Chihiro focused his gaze on this one man right now. Only he was his target. The phrase that Shiba had said a while ago flashed through his mind. It's too early for you to go up against him. But right now, those words didn't bother him. After accumulating all his power, the guy started to use the magic ball spell. Well, then this person wasn't worthy of holding this sword. Magic carp began to swirl around him. Sojo had already started to be covered in flames. His face took on a maddened look. Swords drawn. Let the battle begin. The limousine was traveling down the road, rapidly picking up speed. Shiba was sitting inside, chewing on a fried fish. His gaze was serious and wary. Opposite him sat his comrade. He was also thoughtful. That's right, so Sojo has a piercing cloud. It could cause a lot of problems. They sat opposite each other with pensive faces. Azami was thinking aloud. That's why he thought what was happening was strange. Especially putting a true blow to the auction and those orientations. Even for him, such behavior is utter madness. Assuming he has the piercing cloud, it all adds up. And he's supposedly confident that he can get back at them. Shiba suddenly jumped up from his seat. What? What the hell? The man was puzzled. There was an awkward pause between them for a second. Azami said that since this was the case, so it was really better for the guy to be quiet. He knows this man is ready to fight. That is why he needs to sit quietly. The man's eyes were full of seriousness. During the Unification War, all magic swords were on their side, but their wielders were not the advanced forces. In addition, unlike the ignorant people who wielded them back then. But then Azami noticed that his companion wasn't listening at all and was handing him a fried fish. He's talking about serious things now. What ignorance. Shiba looked out the car window and noticed that there were too many people outside. His companion nodded his head and agreed. Soon they pulled up to a large building that looked like a temple. Last week there were commemorations to honor the end of the war, and it looks like it. And this year they organized a special exhibit. At the entrance hung a plaque that read, 18th anniversary of the end of the war, father of magical swords, in the footsteps of Rokuhiro Kunishige. The children who were brought to the museum today will surely remember Rokuhiro as a hero. A mother holding her child's hand was showing him the exhibition. The child's eyes reflected in human interest. He looked at the exhibits with admiration, and it was as if he imagined himself in the place of this hero. Everyone praises the magical swords and their creator, for their merits ended the war. They have become a past worthy of respect. But now, right in the middle of the street, there are clashes between the owners of the magic swords. Chihiro was lost in speculation. How did he find them? The location of the true strike. Several thoughts flashed through his mind. The boy gripped his magic sword even tighter. It was time for the battle he had been training for all this time. All consciousness was occupied by the sight before his eyes. The boy remembered his father and his instructions. Sojo stared at him in surprise. He was almost unharmed, but even a sword master couldn't stand up to the thunder. Had the power of his sword helped? He was at a loss to guess. The man turned to the boy. He asked, how come he has a magic sword that he knows nothing about? Something about him being persistently interested in the sword. Doesn't he need a girl? The boy suddenly noticed that someone was peeking at him and immediately shifted his gaze back. They both sprinted outside through the doors. Their movements were quick as lightning. Every second was precious. The two opponents jumped high up as if dancing some kind of mad dance. The piercing cloud has 3 features. The thunder is a thunderous boom. The shackles are. But the boy did not have time to complete his thought. The third was the freezing. Sojo swung his sword, and in an instant almost the entire street was under a layer of ice. Chihiro bounced off just in time and shattered the ice shackles that had nearly shackled his body. Sojo watched the boy's every move carefully. His ability is a chopping blow. The thought pierced his head like a dagger. He fended off the kid's attack, throwing his sword high up, but it was a deceptive maneuver. The kid was already behind him and was preparing to stab him in the back. Sojo felt it with some 6th sense. and blocked the guy's blow in time with his sword. There was a clang of metal. The man pushed the boy aside across the stone floor, leaving a trail of dust behind him. He didn't just deflect the blow with an obscure hold. He was even able to push him back. The main thing was to manage to throw him further away for now. Chihiro concentrated and directed his serious gaze straight at his opponent. At this time, the two girls were running away from the battlefield. Hinao was leading the little girl, holding her hand. They had to run away quickly, or their lives would be in mortal danger. The boy realized that he was far superior to him. They stood opposite each other like two duelists. Plus, he wasn't even out of breath, so he put all his strength into that quick maneuver. Sojo stood there, staring at the guy with a crazy look in his eyes. Chihiro prepared himself again and grouped himself. His eyes reflected fury. I guess I'll have to use the gold one. But now, in such a state, even if he succeeded, he could only maintain it for a few seconds. The guy realized that his strength was already running out, and he was not ready for such an overload. Sojo began to speak. In a colorless voice, he said that he loved Rokuhiro Kunishige with all his heart. Because his babies, these balls are extremely close to his heart. He's read all the books on it. And recently he borrowed this sword. A true masterpiece. How enthusiastic he was at that moment. Suddenly his voice changed to a maddening tone. But the moment of bliss proved meek. He clutched the hilt of the sword in his hand. But the boy did not answer his question. He pointed the gun right at the kid. How does a dairy boy like him get a ball he's never even heard of? Where'd he get it? Chihiro said in a calm tone that he didn't have to answer his questions. The man laughed. Well then, let him tell him what he is waving that sword around for. He wants to know if he has the right to wield it. Upon hearing the question, the lad replied that this sword lies in his hand to destroy evil and to save the weak. That is what he fights for. The man wanted eyes. It was obvious that he was not impressed by this story. It was the first time he had heard such enthusiastic speeches. You can make up a whole bunch of beautiful stories, but there's only one reason to create a weapon. Sojo looked toward the boy with a sympathetic gaze. He doesn't understand anything, rookie. The man leaned backward, so much so that he was now ready to fall down from a great height. Flames began to form around him. Finally, the man said that he would now explain to the boy what his father had wished for. Chihiro watched the scene with horror. A strangled scream escaped from his mouth. He couldn't believe the madness that was happening. The man easily bounced off the edge of the roof and rushed down. His father's swords, the most murderous weapons of all. The people below had no idea of the horror that awaited them. These swords only exist for one thing. Soon the man landed on the ground with a loud sound. The ground beneath his feet trembled. His eyes burned with madness as he held a sword in his hand. These swords are made for one thing only, to take other people's lives. Azami calmly said that right in the middle of the street, clashes between magic sword wielders would start. Casualties among the ordinary citizens would be inevitable. And then, all the glory of being a hero would vanish in an instant. Chihiro couldn't let this nightmare happen. He couldn't let his father's good name be tarnished by a freak. The sword in Sojo's hands began to glow with incredible magical power. The man recognized that Rokuhiro was a true master. This ball contained a powerful force. This is a true master of his craft, since he could create such a magnificent weapon. The passers-by stopped for a second and looked back in horror at the madman who was planning something irreparable. But their faces reflected nightmare and horror. Someone tried to run away to the side, but unfortunately, frightened cries of people began to be heard everywhere. Sojo was already completely mad, and there was nothing human left in him. His voice was already at its limit. He used a thunder spell. A powerful explosion shook the entire neighborhood. From afar, a very bright flash of magical light was visible. The assassin stood, dust and smoke swirling around him in a mad dance. He wanted to see the result of his actions now, but all he saw was his rival, who was standing far away from him. The powerful explosion had melted the road, and it was now a kind of magma. Chihiro stood on his feet with his last strength. Smoke was coming from him, and he blocked that powerful blow with his body. Thankfully, none of the bystanders were hurt, which sent Sojo into a frenzy. The man stood there, not realizing how it had happened. In a voice shaking with madness, he asked the boy how he did it. Chihiro replied that it was all on the principle of a lightning rod. If a lightning bolt comes across a lightning rod, it will discharge through it. That's how he saved those people. Sojo stood, trying to comprehend everything that had happened. He attracted the discharge of his sword? You mean his sword also has the power of thunder? Or was it him? He didn't have time to finish his guess. The man raised his sword and in the same crazy voice said that it was too early for the guy to rejoice. Did he catch one lightning bolt and is satisfied? So he can get another one. He was about to use his shattering spell, but something went wrong. The lightning went out before it could even ignite. Flashbacks from his childhood reappeared in the kid's mind. He remembered standing and arguing with his father about his t-shirt. Now he was standing almost completely charred. He could barely breathe. He said in a weakened voice, that of the two of them. Sojo was the only one who didn't understand. The man got even angrier and shouted for the kid to stop acting like a hero. He can barely stand on his own 2 feet. Not surprising, considering he took the hit. In a matter of tens of seconds, everyone around him would be scattering to the sides before the Kamunabi men arrived. But until then, something had to be done. The boy could barely stand, but there was still hope, and an unshakable will to live. A thought uttered in his mind. Magical swords only exist to take other people's lives. Until they came, he had to hold the monster back. The boy bent down into a fighting stance and prepared to make one last dash. The magical carps formed near him once again. It was time for the strongest golden strike. The guy's whole body ached from the incredible overload. He twitched, seemingly unable to strike now as the force had almost completely left him. He clenched his teeth and continued to struggle. The man stood there watching all of this from the sidelines. He said in a sarcastic tone that the boy didn't need to use his powers if he had to work so hard to do so, as if he were mocking the boy. Shozo's face expressed complete incomprehension. How has this guy not given up yet? Does he really have such a strong willpower? At this time, the kid was trying his best to gather the last of his strength into a fist. Looks like there was a leak during the accumulation. Shozo slowly approached him. He asked, "So the guy says swords are to save the weak? Is he protecting the little one out of the same noble motives?" At this time, Hinao Dark Street on the shoulders of a little girl. Shal sitting on her shoulders moved closer to her ear and said that if she was tired, they could switch. The girl grinned and said they should take their time. She realized that there was no way this little girl could help her. The battle was heating up with renewed vigor. Shozo looked disdainfully at his opponent. Nobility? That's a strange word. Murder weapon. That's a word more suited to Rokuhiro's creations. Chihiro at these words became furious. His charred face contorted into a grimace. He shouted that this freak dare not speak of his father like that. It took just half a second for the kid to get very close to his opponent, who barely had time to repel the scintillating attack. The man noticed that the man's power had increased by an order of magnitude over the course of the battle. The water magic splitting the air flew forward. A second later, behind the man's back, an ice formed. The very water that had come from the ball froze in an instant, but the protagonist was unstoppable. He was like a shadow flying through the ice. The man didn't even have time to realize when the kid was behind him. At the last moment, he had time to react and put his sword to the side for counter to attack. Their guns carried at great speed towards the bodies of their owners. One more second, and their lives would not be cut short. The sharp blade of the sword was only a few centimeters away from Shozo's face. The man stared frantically ahead, unable to understand how it was that this brat was fighting him as an equal. The fighters bounced off each other, moving a decent distance away. They had only a few seconds to catch their breath, and then they were ready to fight again. Shozo looked towards the kid in surprise. Did he dodge his punch? This is something he definitely didn't expect. This kid comes out stronger than he expected. At this time, Chihiro was struggling to stay on his feet with his last strength in his fist. His face was already completely covered in blood, and his clothes were worn out from the prolonged battle. He realized that there was no way to keep up with this man's reactions, so it was better to concentrate on counterattack. Almost missed it already. Well, at least fewer people will get hurt. The guy was standing in the middle with smoke coming from his body. Suddenly, through the window of a black car passing by, he saw familiar feet flicker and hide in the depths of the cabin. Two men were sitting there, one of whom he was directly holding something. I had a scary girl in my head, but I got her after all. The guy squeezed the handle of the ball, which had already gotten very hot from this strain. A fleeting memory of the girl's face flashed through her mind, and her words when she said that in that case she would stay with Chihiro. The boy jumped out of his seat like a bullet and rushed to save his friend. From nowhere he had the strength. His main task now was to keep this little girl alive. Shaozo. He noticed this and shouted after him not to run away from him. They're not done yet. In a second, a stone clump appeared from the earth. It was a spell of rock. The guy jumped up. It was the buildings. More people were already approaching him, most likely Shozo's henchmen. The appearance of these people would only make the task more difficult. The man stared at him with his crazed gaze, calculating every move. Several men dressed in various uniforms were approaching him at a rapid pace. They were communarians. The man quickly assessed the situation. 5. From an elite squad. If there were no others, it was possible to fight them, but still something was wrong. He quickly shifted his gaze to the other side, as if he saw something dangerous there. Literally out of nowhere, 2 figures appeared in front of him. They were Shiba and Azami. The 2 men stood there staring at the bastard with serious eyes. Shiba said he should go to Chihiro and help him after all. This kid was almost at his last breath. Azami calmly stopped him. He said wait as soon as he stepped aside, this type would attack. There was no way to give suspicion. With one look, the criminal assessed the situation. It would be very hard to fight them all in this situation, but he had no choice. Shiba ordered the rest of the squad. Act immediately if they can handle him. And his comrade stopped him again. He said they are in the middle of the city and the enemy has a magic sword. Direct confrontation should be avoided as much as possible. Shiba assumed it was just the Zanudas. He had already prepared to attack. At this point, nothing could stop him. The man's gaze turned steely. Shazo used a downpour spell. He swung his sword, trying to stick it into the earth with all his might. A split second later, the street was shaken by a monstrous explosion. Steam flew in different directions, mixed with dust and asphalt shards. At that moment, the guy gathered all his strength into a fist, rushing to help the girl who was being taken away right now by unknown people in their car. All he could think about was saving Shal. The car started, and with a roar of the engine began to speed away in the opposite direction. In the back seat, I could see 2 men holding a girl who was struggling out of the car. Within seconds, the guy was inside the cabin, and all hell broke loose. In one swipe of the ball, he chopped the head off the driver and the man sitting next to him. With all his might, he tried to grab the little girl's severed arm. The guy almost grasped the stump of the small handle, but it was very difficult because the car was going through hell and it was impossible to make out anything. The driver squinted and the windshield immediately flew out. It was hard to tell where whose body was where, so bloody was the fight there. The driver of the car said goodbye to his life in a split second, and the car, left without a steering wheel, began to roll into the bog entering the turn. Unable to stay on the road, it began to roll over and went airborne. At the last minute, the guy jumped out of the cabin through the broken window and pulled the driver, who was barely breathing. The car, engulfed in flames, began to roll over and rumbled upward. The windows flew up finally. A few meters away from the wrecked car, Chihiro landed on the ground and now had the driver pinned to the pavement. He almost growled the only question. What had they done to Shal? Barely breathing, the bloodied driver said they had done everything exactly as Sojo-san had said. He ordered in case there was a chase. The man coughed, a line of blood starting to flow from his mouth. After taking a little breath, he continued. He said that the master had told them to divide it up in case of an emergency, and it worked. The guy fell for it, the man shouted. The protagonist's face darkened even more. He asked, what happened to the other woman? What had they done to her? At this time, Hinao's bloody body was lying somewhere in the back of one of the houses. The girl was no longer breathing and was dead for good. The driver of the car laughed, gurgling blood from his mouth. The guy held a bloody katana to his throat. In a few seconds, the overturned car was on fire and about to explode. It was bursting with thick black smoke. In one deft move, the guy slit the freak's throat. The kid had a full osteo-bloody face, staring off into the distance with an almost lifeless gaze. His father's swords are now in the wrong hands. How strong are their new owners? But he didn't have time to finish his thoughts, as his eyes rolled back and the guy began to slump to the ground, losing consciousness. Shiba jumped up just in time and picked up the lifeless body of the kid, preventing him from falling to the floor. With his last strength, the boy wheezed out the question, "Where's Sojo?" The man replied that the bastard had managed to escape under the cover of the downpour. The black Mercedes was speeding down the night highway, its engine roaring. Nothing could stop this death machine. Inside the cabin, little Shal was sitting and shedding bitter tears. She was incredibly hurt and scared, but she was trying her best to hold herself together, lest she lose shards of consciousness. A male voice laughed and noticed that her limbs were almost industry. The man with the mohawk on his head turned around to look at the girl. Her arms and legs had almost grown out, and now looked like the limbs of a small child, completely disproportionate. Mr. Sojo got into the car. His henchmen greeted him cheerfully. One of them noticed that the Lord had already fully mastered the magic sword. The man looked at his hand with surprise and replied that he wasn't quite there yet. It felt different in real combat, though. He clenched his fist and looked up with a dejected look. Still, one must study this sword, and even better. The man in the back seat wouldn't let up. But anyway, they got the material back, so we can go ahead with their plan. Soyo nodded to surpass Rokuhiro Kunishiga. It was his life's goal. The man had wanted to reach that level for as long as he had lived in the world. His accomplice asked if the gentleman was no longer interested in the magic sword. The man replied that of course he was, but now his plans had changed a bit. Pensive, the man closed his eyes and began to remember that guy's shout when he told him not to dare talk about his father like that. He smiled and said in a creepy voice that he'd have to talk to that guy again. Chihiro was bleeding with every passing minute. His eyes were about to roll up, awareness sinking into a grim viscera and an abyss of darkness. Through the darkness, he uttered only one phrase out of his last strength. "Sojo, I will kill you." And then consciousness finally left the guy. After a long time, he woke up. His face was completely bandaged and his whole body ached as if he had been run over by a freight train. Very heavy with weakness. The boy shrieked. This was a bad idea right now. He carefully got out of bed. It turned out that he was in a hospital now. There were a lot of wires connected to him. He opened his eyes with difficulty and began to examine his wounded body. He clenched his teeth at the pain that echoed in every corner of his body. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice. His eyes widened as if with joy. Shiba stood in the doorway with his companion. He looked at the boy with a surprised look, as if he had just seen something divine. The man rushed toward him, but Azami stopped him and put a finger to his lips, urging him to be a little quieter. The guy started head-on, still not realizing where he was. Shiba said that now the guy had to lie back down and rest and get on with it. Azami apologized for them coming to him so abruptly uninvited. It was an ordinary hospital building. Many patients came to it every day in an attempt to cure their ailments. Azami started talking. He said that the treatment at the Kaminabi clinic was undoubtedly better, but that the boy had gotten into the registry records there. And there are a lot of Kaminabi members who don't think much of his father. The boy nodded understandingly. After hesitating a bit, the kid asked what happened to Shal and Hinao. "Anxiety," Shiba said in a serious voice that Hinao had miraculously survived and her condition was more or less stable now. At least she was strong enough to eat the apple he'd chopped into slices. The boy breathed a sigh of relief, a weight off his shoulders. Finally, some good news after such a long time. But then, the man's gaze darkened. He continued to speak. Spia said that Shal was most likely alive. It was obvious how difficult it was for the man to find the right words. "Most likely?" the boy asked again, as if something inside him had snapped. The man had said that it looked like that girl was Sojo's main target. Also, according to the information from that assassin. Sojo received the heavenly stone. Chihiro must have heard of this ball. The boy's eyes widened in surprise. He tried to comprehend what he had heard. Material for a magic sword, exactly. A scary one flashed through my mind. It's a specimen that was discovered during the war years. Even now, only 250 kilograms of this stone are known to exist. By increasing the spiritual forces hidden in it, one can achieve such a high density of them, which cannot be generated by the human body. Sojo walked briskly into the room and kept talking. His associates opened their mouths in surprise. It's like magic swords. However, the powers derived from wearing the stone are inherently poisonous. The highly concentrated power of the stone gradually begins to seep into the wearer's body. At some point, the body of the stone's owner will not be able to match it. The man paused rhetorically. And eventually, the owner of the sword may die. And only one man in this world, Rokuhiro Kunishiga. Only he was able to stabilize this power. To this day, Sojo has not been able to master the processing techniques that this man possessed. He walked over to another man and put his hand on his shoulder. It was the scientist, and he said proudly that everything was ready. The master nodded affirmatively. They were standing in some large laboratory. In the center of the room was an unknown device with many tubes and wires stretching from it. The order was given to begin. Chihiro all business on his bed. He didn't understand. But after all, it was only his father who possessed the technique of subduing with the power of stone. How could it be possible? In a heavy voice, Shiba said that as Sojo himself says, the cells of the descendants of the Kiyonagi lineage are the key to stabilizing the force. He's going to use the heavenly stone and the girl to create a new weapon. Use. That word imprinted itself on the boy's mind. It sounded like this girl was some kind of thing. In his thoughts, he imagined a poor little girl sitting behind bars in front of a plate of porridge. No one can help her. She's all alone in this cruel, monstrous world, and has to cope with all the hardships of life alone. In a plate divided into several pieces was something that looked like food, but it was more like vomit. The girl looked disgusted at what was brought to her. Na had no choice. Either she would eat it now or he would starve to death. Several other people came into the cage dressed in hospital gowns and shoe covers. She was sitting on the floor and was almost unresponsive. The scientists put her on the couch and began to examine her from all sides, as if she were some kind of guinea pig, although she probably was. One of the doctors said they needed to take her back and undress her. 2 parts calf muscles and the ligament of the knee. They were listing all the body parts they'd need. Well, it was time to begin this hellish procedure. Several doctors crowded around the couch where poor girl was sitting. One of them ordered to take her back to the cage. The procedure was over. The man in gloves took a small vial with an unknown liquid, put it under the glass. The girl was conventionally shoved back into the cage. The heavy door shut behind her with a rumble. In a stern, cold voice, the scientist said, starting the injection, and slid the lever forward. The entire room hummed, and filled with some sort of vibration, the infernal device in the middle of the room began to work. The scientist said that since his boss was using flesh, wouldn't it be better to fatten up the guinea pig? The man asked, what was he talking about? He said indifferently that, after all, you could cut off as much as you needed. The girl would still regenerate. Chihiro sat in his hospital bed, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. He couldn't bear the thought that this little innocent child was about to be used for some inhuman purpose. Hot tears flowed down his cheeks. He gritted his teeth in unbelievable anger. His soul was completely empty. He hadn't been able to save this little innocent creature from the hands of those freaks. But after a second, he came to his senses. The guy immediately asked, where is his sword? He was told that it was kept in a safe place. Shiba apologized to the man and told him that he had been too careless. The man hadn't expected his opponent to not even care about the Kamunabi. Azami said that was exactly what his phrase was before he could say it, as Shiba interrupted him. He looked at his comrade irritably and asked, what if only information poured out on him immediately after waking up from his coma? Would that be cool? In a slightly cheerful voice, the guy said he was fine and they could continue. He was curious. The man continued his story. After what happened, they too began to hastily develop a plan to counter Sojo. A special team has already been formed to fight the cloud carriers. Azami said that the guy was the best at magic swords, so in order for the operation to be as successful as possible, he would like to set the guy up with these people. Chihiro was silent for a moment, as if thinking about the pros and cons. The man said he perfectly understands the guy's wariness but would like him to trust him. Shiba said it's okay. The squad is made up of only Azami's subordinates. They're all good guys. Several men twisted the masked stranger and pinned him against the wall. He had no chance to escape. The girl in a cheerful voice said that now all he had to do was keep quiet. The man in tears cried out in pain. He had been grabbed really hard. Another man said that in the hospital it is supposed to be quiet. They sat down in different ones. The guy with the glasses ordered everyone to be quiet. They needed to finally get down to business by now. The man in glasses smiled and began to speak in a calm and even tone. Shiba had learned the location from Sojo's henchmen, but intelligence reported that he had already gotten the heck out of there. As soon as they find his lair, they'll move in with a decisive action. Until then, they need to refine their plan of action, and he'd like to hear from him. The guy shook his head affirmatively, but he had one condition. In a serious voice, he said that in that case, they would undertake to take him with them to the operation. One of the members of the group looked at him perplexed, a mute question in his eyes. He shook his head negatively. No way. He might be Rokuhiro's son, but they have their own rules. The masked man told him not to be angry at their newcomer. He always cocks his head when he sees someone young and talented. After that, he turned to the newcomer and said that they couldn't ignore the young and talented one. The newcomer heard these words and started to protest, but he was quickly twisted. The girl wondered, weren't there any injured people there? In a battle of magic swords? The man with glasses turned around and asked her, didn't she know about this? The girl replied that when they first drove up here, it was to see huge clouds in the distance. Did he manage to avoid being a victim of such conditions, but why? There was a sense of genuine surprise in the girl's voice. The guy replied in a calm tone that he just took on the entire lightning discharge with the power of his magic sword. The masked man shouted in surprise. He was willing to risk his life saving the civilian question marks. Thoth laughed. This small is pretty brave. The boy shook his head and started to be modest. No, he wasn't planning to die. He just thought that since Sojo wasn't very good with the magic ball yet, he had a chance to survive. The masked man did not hide his admiration, but approached the guy almost closely. The guy in the glasses, irritated, said, yes, he's a brave fellow indeed. Sheba cut in and said that the kid was hurt pretty badly himself. The muscles in his left arm were torn to shreds. He needs bed rest for the next month. Hearing those words, it was like he blacked out for a split second. How's that? He can't move at all? They didn't hide their surprise. This guy, even in this condition, didn't drop the sword and continued to fight? The masked man said that unfortunately they didn't expect to stall their plan for that long. They started the search the same day the guy checked himself into the hospital 5 days ago. The kid grabbed his head. Had he slept for 5 whole days? Grief could be heard in his voice. Sheba shook his head. A horrible guess flashed through the kid's mind while he'd been holed up here. Shal had been suffering all this time. The man with glasses studied the guy carefully. After gathering his thoughts, Chihiro said in a confident voice that he wanted to go with them all the more. The man looked at him through his glasses with a serious, startled look. There was not a hint of pity for his opponent in that look. He said in a serious voice that it was unfortunately their squad's job to kill Sojo, and saving that girl was not their main goal. He pointed his finger at the guy, and he said, but he's a brave man by all accounts, capable of recklessness. He's the kind of guy who'll run away from the ward when sitting quietly is the best option. The man reflected. Perhaps the most dangerous option is to leave it unattended, therefore. The man leaned even closer to his bed. While they were dealing with this criminal, the boy would have to quietly rescue the girl. With his abilities and recklessness, their plan would be perfect. The girl from their squad, Riley, remarked that they didn't actually have a plan yet, if anything. In a serious voice, the head of the gang asked the boy, is he in? Chihiro looked at him with a serious gaze, and it was obvious from his look that he was ready to rush into battle right now. Sojo's face was full of anticipation, his mouth ajar as if he wanted to say something. The kid's bandaged arm lay on the hospital bed. Now he couldn't fully use it as the ligaments were almost completely destroyed. But then the thought flashed through his mind that the little girl, while he was now sprawled out in the hospital, was locked up and probably suffering terrible agony. In a voice full of confidence, the man loudly announced that he was in. The gang leader concluded that they had already discussed the plan. Now it was time to move on to its realization. His face was just as calmly serious. We'll have to wait for news of their target's location. He didn't think they'd have to wait long. It was unlikely that the bastard had completely disappeared into the fog. He was probably still doing his trading. Finishing his reasoning, the man turned to the kid anyway. As soon as something was clear, they would contact him first. Soon everyone left the room, leaving the boy alone with Siba. Toya at the window, the man asked the boy if he was hurt. In pain, the guy nodded his head and said he could move. He looked down at his left arm, except it wasn't good at all. Almost can't feel it. There was only one thought flashing through his mind. That of killing that bastard. Sheba thought that at this moment the kid was terribly annoyed. The man's mind wandered back to his youth. When they were 18 years old, they acted like complete idiots. The man turned his gaze to the boy who was lying in the hospital bed. In a good-natured, fatherly voice, he said that he was a pretty talented guy. Suddenly, the phone on the nearby nightstand vibrated. A few people were approaching a huge ruined temple. The roof of the temple was almost completely destroyed, whether by explosions or wind. There were several men dressed in dress uniforms sitting at the table. One of them got up from the table and said he was going to take a piss. The other men wryly nodded at him that now he might not come back. He laughed sarcastically in response to them. Sitting around the table, they were grudgingly discussing today's events. Yeah, why do they even need to sit on the lookout? No one would even risk coming in here. The second man confirmed. Right, there's only one little one here already, right? And they had hired a few warlocks to guard them for some reason. Suddenly, another man with long hair appeared on the roof like a shadow on the roof. On the steps sat a huge, heavy man with big hands. There was another man standing by the door, holding his katana at the ready. People continued to sit around the table and jokingly talk to each other. Although the gentleman himself doesn't even have bodyguards. Another man said that he didn't need them because he was very strong himself. Even now, he's going out alone. The third man worriedly asked where he was going. Apparently he didn't know. Heavy gray clouds hung over the city, covering the sky almost completely. Small migratory birds flew here and there. Several people were heading towards the entrance of some establishment. The first one walking among them pulled back the curtain and started to go inside. Inside, lying in the pool, was Mr. Sojo. He was taking a hot bath and lying there thinking about something of his own. He remembered the picture of a bloodied Chihiro shouting at him not to speak of his father like that. He couldn't forget that face. The man still couldn't get rid of the thought that this guy was really the son of a great swordsman. The muscular figure of the great swordmaster also appeared in his mind. Well, it was entirely possible, it couldn't be ruled out. A very convincing theory, but the man still had his doubts. He remembered the guy's words when he said that swords were needed to destroy evil and save the weak. Tired of his annoying thoughts, the man leaned back and shouted that this was unthinkable. A few more people came into his sauna. The man who entered said he wished he could say the same thing. He dropped the small suitcase he had brought here for some reason. Sojo looked at the new arrivals with a start. He recognized one of them and asked casually, "Why did he come?" The suitcase contained an incomprehensible device held together by several bolts. Proudly, the man boasted that this was what he had bought the other day. Sojo looked in his direction with disdain and asked, and he personally came to return it to him. In a serious voice, the man said that was exactly what he was counting on. Plus, he said there were markings on this stone and he didn't like being chased. Sojo rolled his eyes and asked if he had succeeded in breaking up the hostile organization. The man nodded and said it wasn't difficult. But then the trouble started. His warlock's body exploded. Sojo looked at him silently. Suddenly the man shifted to shouting. He shouted that this wasn't their agreement. This mage was the backbone of his faction. Sojo said in an indifferent voice that he had warned him about this from the beginning. A wide smile stretched on his face. He said that you could get power comparable to a magic ball for a while, but there would be a big boom in the end. It turns out that it was their own fault. Apparently the man got tired of listening to all this. He said he didn't come here to make excuses and listen. He ordered his henchmen to capture the bastard immediately. It took just a moment for the smell of blood to waft through the air. In a split second, the water in the pool turned blood red. To make matters worse, the entire sauna was stained with blood, and dead people were lying on the floor. Sojo rolled his eyes upward dreamily. Was he still unable to achieve control over the heavenly stone? Theoretically, this should have gone off without too much trouble. But there's something missing. He remembered the guy saying that of the two of them. He was the only one who didn't understand anything. Sojo got out of the bathroom and started drying his long black hair. He was standing near a large mirror and was rubbing his hair. He knows. Not only about magic swords, but I'm a heavenly stone, right? The man turned to the elderly woman standing outside the door. He asked her gruffly, had she reported it yet? He got his clothes out of his locker and thought he still needed to fight this guy one more time. Maybe this kid really is the son of the great swordmaster. Well, now it's time to find out. Next time they meet again, he needs to find out all the answers. So there are no loose ends. The man was dressing quickly, and besides, he had another problem to solve at the same time. The old woman came closer and looked at him with her wrinkled face. In an old voice, she asked him what he wanted. The man irritably said that he had left a very valuable item here, so let her hurry up and find it immediately. The old woman, as if she remembered something, and changed in front of him, pulling out her sword. With a shudder, she handed the sword to the man. He grasped its cold point, and once again, as if maddened, achieving a complete understanding of the ball is what he must strive for. He got up from the floor and quickly alighted toward the sauna exit. Yes, this is exactly what he needs. He thought, walking out the wooden doors. A man came out of the sauna and didn't even realize he was already being followed. Illusions before the war began. All Japanese knowledge of warlocks had been reduced to that word. Everyone silently agreed that warlocks had nothing to do with the regular world. But the warlock's involvement in the war opened the public's eyes to their existence. And now, many of them operate in broad daylight. But the fact that this country hasn't collapsed is entirely to your credit. As soon as the man walked out of the sauna doors, he immediately noticed that there were several people dressed in black clothing standing on the rooftops. These were members of the Kamunabi, a special unit to fight the piercing cloud. Its commander was Hagiwara Ikudo. He's toward the criminal. I said he took too long. So is he ready to fight? But suddenly a hunch pierced his head. This man is calm. Was he waiting for them? It was impossible to foresee this freak's action. Sojo still looked up at them with the same emotionless gaze. He nodded his head and Riley said as he warmed up. Several people were still sitting at the table discussing something. One of them irritably asked where their comrade's begging sign he is still in the toilet, or what. It was taking a long time. He told him he might not come back, though. The other man laughed and said he must have listened to him. Suddenly there's a goldfish between the men. Everyone looked in her direction in surprise. What was she doing here? At this time, the fish swam through the air as if this was a regular thing for it. The men turned around and saw in the distance of the corridor in the shadows an obscure black figure standing and looking at them. The guys looked at each other worriedly. Who was that? One of them reached for the phone on the table. The telephone set continued to vibrate insistently, drawing attention to itself. One of the guys picked up a cell phone and put it to his ear and started talking. The other side of the phone asked how they were doing. The guy worriedly asked why they were calling. On the other side of the phone, a cheerful voice said he just felt like it. They're out there on duty anyway. The man clenched his teeth and apologized, saying he'd call back later. The concerned voice asked what was their emergency. The man tried his best to hide his excitement and said he just had a stomachache. Chihiro approached him like a ghost. All of his accomplices were already dead, and there was a sea of blood all around. In a trembling voice, the boy asked, what should he do? As if resigned to his fate. There was already a squad of Kaminari standing on the rooftops and watching the whole thing from above. Sojo coming out of the sauna holding the sword for him already flew the ghost dragon. Indeed, elite. These 5 are serious opponents. But he wanted to try his sword on those 2. The squad girl folded her arms and began to use the plum rock spell. Under the man's feet, the ground began to shake, as if something was trying to break through it. The street was shaken by powerful blows. Passers-by looked up frightened, and up above they saw a huge rock that had formed literally out of nowhere. The piercing cloud has 3 abilities. The protagonist sat on the bench and listened intently. Ice, which is good for offense and defense. This spell is called Shackles. Water, which is good for distraction. It's called Downpour. Lightning, which has high striking power. This spell is called Thunder. The newcomer of the squad rolled his eyes. This was basic knowledge. They would know everything themselves if they understood a little about the topic. The masked man said not to listen to him and continued. You mean the piercing cloud of the strongest sword? The masked man with a long nose asked in surprise. The girl said she was scared and invited Adzami to go along with them. The man replied that this was a task the 6 of them would have to solve. The boy was surprised. 6 of them? The girl replied that another friend of theirs was now on a scouting mission, but it's a mistake to think that killing the main villain will solve the problem. There's an auction coming up and the Hisayaku are behind it. They, the Komunabi, shouldn't waste their energy. The man with glasses started to speak in a serious tone as there was a huge difference between them and magicians with magic balls. They shouldn't rely on the strength of any one person. They need a solid plan. Several members of the squad galloped over the huge stone islands that had formed in the air as a result of the spell. The sea is 2 kilometers ahead. The girl told the kid not to distract her, but rather to watch her back. The best option was to move the battle to the sky so as not to damage the city. Sojo was mad at this insolence. He would show them. The man used a thunder spell. Lightning bolts began to develop around, and from where they came, a magical dragon appeared. Several members of the squad rushed to attack to hold back this maddened beast. The hand of the man in the nasal mask became stone-like and impenetrable. He put it out for defense, and the bandit's sword hit it with a loud clang. From behind, another squad member was already flying at him, preparing to deliver a crushing blow to his back. But the bastard pushed back the man holding him back just in time and used an ice spell to defend himself from the swords flying at him. The head used a magnetism spell to pull out the sword stuck in the ice crust. The ice broke with a crack, and the swords continued their flight towards their target. Another squad member jumped high up and folded his hands into a fist to destroy the villain. There was a tremendous bang, and dust and stones flew in different directions. People mingled in an unimaginable flow. It was hard to tell who was where. The guy seems to have figured it out. They have to use their numbers. The main thing is to not give him time to recharge. All the squad members were sitting on the balcony, discussing the future event. The recharging necessary to maximize strength is an important element of combat equipment. Chihiro said that when he fought this man a few days ago, he realized that he hasn't fully mastered this sword yet, but he has a fighting sense. The guy wouldn't be surprised if he pays attention to his own mistakes. He'll probably behave differently in the next fight. You have to be ready for it. The one who now gets under full attack will definitely die. The battle was unfolding at a rapid speed. The opponents were moving with such speed that it was almost impossible to catch them with human eyes. Sojo looked at them with disdain. And what was so frightening about charging him? What a bunch of losers. These skills don't need to be recharged. The man stuck his sword into the ground and cast a rain spell. A large amount of water appeared around to conceal his presence. Following that, he quickly applied a thunder spell. The magical connection worked, and everyone present began to be hit with electricity. Their faces contorted in grimaces more. They had not expected such a turn of events. Soon they hit the ground and were now unable to move. The squad leader stared at his opponent in amazement. He alternately used thunder and downpour. Utilizing insufficient thunder and a virtually non-recharging downpour, one of the primary combat tactics with this sword. Using the properties of water to conduct electricity, even weak lightning can be successfully attacked. The man with glasses exclaimed in admiration. How good this sword is, doesn't it have any flaws? Chihiro continued to speak with a serious tone. If they didn't give him a break, that person would surely start using that very tactic. In that case, they should take the hit anyway. Everyone exclaimed in surprise. How can that be? The kid kept talking. He said as the energy builds up a little, they'll be hit a lot weaker than they were then. Still, that was painful enough. The man in the nasal mask asked, why would they want to get hit? Because their pressure would be relieved and the perpetrator would get a break. The man continued to charge his sword with an energy wave for the next strike. Chihiro said in a serious voice to make it hit with a full-fledged thunderclap. All three of them exclaimed in surprise. This is unthinkable, they are all going to die. The boy said that if they fail, there will be many casualties, since this is the cloud's most dangerous ability, but it has one major flaw. Therefore, should they attack it continuously? Asked the head, so that he would realize that they are afraid of reloading the ball, and then he will get that opportunity. And he fell for it in a big way. The masked man said that. But there's still the problem of the last thunder. The guy replied that their battlefield would probably be packed by then. What they do after that is up to them. Elite squad members. The squad leader loudly commanded everyone to go up and they all jumped high at once. Sojo looked down at them and said that they wouldn't succeed. The man immediately used a thunder spell. The squad leader in turn summoned magnetism. At this time, the two spells mixed together, and it was as if the air itself was electrified now. There would be a powerful explosion. The man didn't realize what was happening. Was he directing his attack into the ground and raising the water from his downpour? In this case, the entire lightning discharge will go through the water. Although it was not possible to completely block the strike, the plan worked. The squad leader smiled and thanked his opponent. He had prepared everything for them himself. Now he instantly ordered his subordinates to attack him, and together they all rushed straight at the man. At that moment, the perpetrator realized everything was going to hell. The ruined temple still towered with its domes into the night's dark sky. The only entrance that isn't guarded by warlocks is the door on the west side. When one goes to the basement, one will see a staircase leading deeper. The lab where the girl is being held is right there, in the back of the hall minus the second floor. Except there's security. The entrance to it is guarded by several warlocks. The man grinned and said that the boy wouldn't get past them. From the look of him, he's all torn up. How long can he keep overpowering his pain? All right, let him go downstairs and let them finish him off there. At this moment, the main character was like a ghost. His face and body were completely hidden by darkness. Magical swords have a special essence beyond what one would expect. Many things in this science are difficult to explain in words. Heavenly stone creation of nature is a source of power for them. On the theoretical limits of possibility, very much depends on the master of the sword.